I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 226 The Stupid Method. Charles was silent for a moment. He knew that Britain would ultimately choose to land in the Dardanelles. This wasn't entirely due to the First Lord of the Admiralty or British strategy. Historically, the two factions, North and South, had argued for months without reaching a decision. Ultimately, Russia, facing a blockade of its shipping lanes, appealed to Britain for help, and only then did Britain agree to the southern landing plan. Therefore, the decisive factor was Russia's predicament, which concerned the entire Eastern Front and even the outcome of the Allied victory. Charles laid his cards on the table with General Winter. You guessed right, General, I do not support a landing, either side. But if a landing is unavoidable, I believe the North will minimize potential losses and casualties. What? General Winter thought he had misheard. The North? That's where the main German forces are, and our landing troops will have to carefully avoid the German high seas fleet. The South won't have these problems. Charles gently shook his head. You think the South is easier? That's the Dardanelles Strait, 61 kilometers long and only 1.2 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. The Ottoman Empire didn't have to do anything, they just had to drop mines in there, and that would be enough to give you a hard time. Besides, there were cannons of all calibers on the shore bombarding the warships. Charles didn't explain further. He continued, my plan is this, the northern landing is real, the southern landing is just a feint. The purpose is to draw the Germans' limited resources and reinforcements to the south, so they won't be able to deal with our main force landing in the north. That's unrealistic, Colonel. General Winter interrupted Charles. Although the Germans do have resource problems under the British blockade, the north is German territory or very close to it, and there's a well-developed transportation network there. Charles ignored General Winter and continued, then, including our series of landing operations in the south, are all a smokescreen, to draw German reinforcements and attention to the south, including luring the German fleet to break out. General Winter seemed to understand something. You mean, to encircle and annihilate the German fleet, but then he thought it didn't make sense. If Charles's goal was to encircle and annihilate the German fleet, he shouldn't have said it so directly. Charles didn't speak. General Winter considered for a moment, then suddenly realized, the south, your target has always been the south. Charles focused on drinking his coffee, not even looking up. General Winter's thinking became increasingly convinced of the truth, and he soon became excited. Yes, if the Germans continue to believe that we are attacking the north, and that the south is all a feint, they won't provide the Ottoman Empire with much reinforcement, including artillery, mines, and troops. Fantastic. Even if our men do land in the south, the Germans might still think it's a feint. General Winter excitedly shook Charles's shoulder, completely ignoring the coffee Charles nearly spilling from his hand. Fantastic, Colonel, you're a genius. This will greatly help our offensive. By the time the Germans realize this, it might be too late. Charles calmly replied, I need to remind you, General, the South isn't as simple as you think. You should be fully aware of this and take it seriously. No problem. Colonel, General Winter nodded, I will relay your warning to the Minister of the Navy. Then General Winter hesitated for a moment, leaned forward, and asked in a low voice, how can we convey the intelligence about the attack in the north to the Germans flawlessly? Charles answered decisively, I agree with Albert I's idea of attacking the north, but with a feint attack plan, and then we'll do what needs to be done. Nothing else needs to be done, General Winter asked, somewhat puzzled. Those who knew about the plan and participated in the discussions were all high-ranking military officers, completely trustworthy people who wouldn't cause any problems. What if a trap was set, and the Germans knew nothing? Charles added, the truth should only be known by British officers, and as little as possible. Understand? General Winter instantly understood. The problem lay with the French officers. They would perfectly pass on the fake plan to the Germans. Having grasped this, General Winter looked at Charles with a half-smile. Now it was Charles's turn to be embarrassed. This was France's Achilles heel. While Britain might be declining in other areas, its military intelligence had always been very tight. The National Security Agency, MI5, was responsible for domestic intelligence work, and the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, for external intelligence. The two, each fulfilling their respective duties and cooperating, had developed a relatively mature intelligence network and summarized a set of effective methods. But in France, Charles only knew of a second Bureau counterintelligence agency, nothing else. At the Schneider arms factory, snowflakes drifted outside the French windows, creating a somewhat oppressive atmosphere in the office. Pauline, looking dejected, handed James a document. "Sir, this is the military's order for tanks from the Charles Tractor Factory, 30,000 francs per tank, with an initial order of 500. Many other countries have also placed orders." James was signing other documents, and during a break, he took the order statistics and tossed them aside, grunted, and continued signing. Pauline sighed softly. James's reaction suggested he had given up on competing with Charles. Charles's tank development was too fast, too perfect, simply unbelievable. The Charles A1 had shocked everyone in the Cape Town battle. This small 8-ton tank easily destroyed an opponent weighing tens of tons, and with overwhelming force from all sides. Pauline had studied that battle, and she couldn't help but compare the Saint-Chamond and the Charles A1 in a contest. She hoped the Saint-Chamond would win. But the results disappointed Pauline time and again. Charles A1 could always remain undefeated by using the same tactics in mobile warfare against Saint-Chamond. Seeing James remain silent, Paulina assumed the matter was over and turned to leave dejectedly. "You've completely given up, haven't you?" James stopped what he was doing. "What else can we do?" Paulina turned back, a hint of doubt flashing in her eyes. "You've done a good job." James nodded. "Continue." A strange expression appeared on Paulina's face. She didn't understand. What was the point of continuing like this? James seemed to understand Paulina's thoughts. He smiled slightly, his tone relaxed. "We can use a clumsy method to slow down Charles, while learning Charles's tactics and design concepts. Surpassing him in the future isn't impossible." A clumsy method. Paulina didn't understand at first, but then she thought of it and nodded in agreement. Chapter 227. The image below shows the Hotel Laurenceau in Paris, opened in 1903. In the 6th arrondissement of Paris, at the Hotel Laurenceau, the fireplace crackled in the warm meeting room. Colonel Johnson, puffing on a cigar, nervously glanced at his pocket watch. The hands pointed to 10, but no one was in sight. Was he going to be out of the running again? Colonel Johnson was the head of the U.S. Tank Research Laboratory. Ever since the first tank appeared on the battlefield and achieved victory, the U.S. military had immediately developed a strong interest in this weapon that could reduce casualties. Colonel Johnson, a graduate of Princeton University, was tasked with establishing the Tank Research Laboratory. The military hoped to develop its own American tank, but after more than a month of effort, Colonel Johnson regretfully discovered that they could only build tanks like the CLB-75. A tractor chassis with steel plates, that was Colonel Johnson's understanding of a tank. The finished product resembled an ironclad warship from the Civil War, only scaled down for land. What else could it be? Colonel Johnson thought. It was simply meant to stop bullets, so the shape couldn't be wrong. Soon Johnson realized his mistake. The French had left them far behind. First came the Mark I, with its superior trench-crossing capabilities, which won an unexpected victory on the battlefield. Then came the Char A1, even more astonishing, miniaturized to the point of being operated by only 2 men and featuring a rotating turret. After much deliberation, a clueless Colonel Johnson could only report to General Smith, "I think part of the reason is that they are in combat, they know what the battlefield requires. Those of us who are not participating in the war are destined to fall behind, so I suggest purchasing tanks from France, or licensing production. We should learn their technology before considering innovation, so as not to fall too far behind." General Smith agreed, and Colonel Johnson rushed to France day and night. Upon arrival, he discovered that many countries were eager to purchase the Char A1 tank. Spain, Switzerland, Romania, many countries hoped to acquire this tank to strengthen their armies. The French government representative told Johnson with difficulty, "We have operational needs, Colonel. Of course, we must prioritize producing tanks for ourselves. The military has already placed a large order. You'd better wait a while." Johnson couldn't tolerate waiting, because for the United States, it meant falling behind. Finally, the French representative, unable to resist the pressure, could only reply, "Unless you can persuade the Charles." Time ticked by. Johnson checked his watch. 10 minutes had passed the agreed time. His mood gradually darkened. It seemed this was not a realistic possibility. His assistant, Nathan, said, "Perhaps they won't come." "If it were me, I wouldn't be in such a hurry to sell the most advanced equipment," Johnson grunted in agreement. It was wartime. If tanks like the Char A1 were sold everywhere, the Germans could easily obtain crucial data and even technology. However, even with just a 1% chance, Johnson was willing to wait. It was just a matter of spending a little more time. At that moment, the meeting room door opened. A young colonel in military uniform entered with an assistant dressed in civilian clothes. The colonel quickly stepped forward and shook hands with Johnson. "I'm sorry, Colonel Johnson, I'm late." Charles hadn't intentionally arrived late. He had spent some time receiving General Winter, and their discussions were more important military matters. He couldn't very well reschedule halfway through. "It's all right, Colonel Charles." Colonel Johnson was somewhat flattered and awkwardly gestured for Charles to sit down. "I received a message from the government," Charles said bluntly. "I heard you're interested in purchasing Charles A1 tanks." "Yes," Johnson nodded hastily. "But as you know," Charles said with a troubled expression, "we're currently at war, and we just received an order from the military for 500 tanks. If we're to produce the tanks you need, we might have to wait." Charles's gaze shifted to Djokovic. Djokovic understood and chimed in, "With our current production capacity, it might take about 6 months. This tank isn't as simple as other tanks." Charles turned his gaze back to Johnson. "We'll prioritize production for you." "How many do you need?" Colonel Johnson's newly roused confidence plummeted. 6 months? At the current rate of tank upgrades and iterations, they'd likely be outdated again. "Actually," Colonel Johnson hesitated, "I'm considering another option. Could we cooperate through licensed production? As previously considered, licensed production carries the risk of leaks, making it much more difficult than purchasing." Johnson was only asking as a last resort, hoping for the best. He expected Charles to refuse outright, but Charles frowned as if in thought. This won't put pressure on our production capacity." Johnson, sensing an opportunity, immediately took out a cooperation proposal from his briefcase and handed it to Charles. "Please rest assured, the confidentiality work can be overseen by your country's intelligence personnel, and we will cover all expenses. Furthermore, we are willing to pay a licensing fee of $1 million, with the intellectual property fee to be calculated separately." Joke's eyes lit up instantly. $1 million was a huge sum at this time, equivalent to 43 million francs at the exchange rate. His wealth had quadrupled in an instant. But Charles pushed the cooperation plan back. "That's not what I need, Colonel Johnson." Before he could even feel disappointed, Colonel Johnson's eyes lit up instantly. "Then what do you need?" "As long as we can do it, you know," Charles calmly replied. "The Germans have occupied the industrial region of northeastern France, which accounts for 68% of our steel industry. We are currently facing a severe shortage of steel, especially special steel for tank production." "No problem," Colonel Johnson readily agreed. "We will export special steel to you unconditionally." "No," Charles said, "if I authorize your country to produce tanks, you can directly send us the finished tank armor, which will speed up our production." "You see." "Of course," Johnson nodded eagerly. This was a small matter for the United States, and he certainly wouldn't refuse. What he didn't know was that this was a big deal for Charles. At this time, the forging of special steel was controlled by Schneider, which would become a weapon for Schneider to control Charles. But now, there was no longer that worry. Charles could even continue to expand cooperation with the United States in the field of special materials in the future. The image above shows the CLB-75 tank developed by the United States, which was not used in actual combat but only in exercises. Chapter 228 Weaver Pistol Shooting. In the Schneider Arms factory office, James sat leisurely by the fireplace, sipping wine. Just moments before, he had reached an agreement with Wendell to double the price of special steel, and this was only the beginning. It would soon double, triple, and potentially rise even higher. The reason was simple: scarcity drives up prices. During the war, France desperately needed steel, and with 68% of its steel industry occupied by the Germans, the supply couldn't meet the demand, making price increases inevitable. Special steel, originally used for battleship armor, now had another purpose: tank armor. Before this, James hadn't realized the importance of special steel for tanks until he heard that German tanks used ordinary steel in the Battle of Cape Town. Note: the German A7V tank used ordinary steel. Its 15 mm thick side and rear armor was roughly equivalent to 11 mm of special armor. James keenly sensed that while the amount of special steel needed for tanks was small, it was crucial. Without special steel, thicker steel plates would be required to achieve the same level of protection. Thicker steel plates would result in greater weight. Greater weight would consume more engine power and affect tank mobility. The Char tank lacked a steel mill and the forging technology for special steels. This was its weakness. Therefore, by simply increasing the price of special steel, even if the Char tank won a military order, there wouldn't be much profit margin. Profit was secondary. More importantly, Schneider could simply bypass the patent and imitate the Char A1 tank to achieve similar performance, but at a much lower cost. A similar tank, but Schneider's cheaper. Which should the military choose? Thinking this, James took a sip of his drink by the burning flames, a smug smile on his lips. However, Paulina stood silently beside James and softly called out, "Sir." James turned to look at Paulina in confusion. He knew her tone meant bad news. Sure enough, Paulina reported, "Charles has signed a contract with the United States, authorizing the U.S. military to produce the Charles A1, and the U.S. military will provide Charles with affordable special steel." James raised his hand to stop Paulina from continuing, his face ashen. Upon hearing the word United States, he realized what had happened. Charles had used its technological advantage to secure overseas resources, thwarting James's plan to cripple Charles through materials, and rendering it unworkable in the future. Seeing James's distress, Paulina wanted to persuade him to give up. It was hopeless. After the appearance of the Charles A1 tank, everyone was left far behind, and no one could compete with Charles in tank technology, including Schneider. Who was this Charles that he could make Schneider helpless against him? However, Paulina knew James wouldn't give up easily. Giving up meant acknowledging Charles' rise. Charles could survive solely on tank orders, and no amount of suppression from Schneider could change that. Sure enough, the next second James said, "Call Eugen over. We need to discuss the new tank further. If other methods don't work, we'll have to break through head-on." Bang bang bang, bang bang. At the police training base's indoor shooting range, Charles held a revolver and fired at a half-chest target. This was preparation for going to the battlefield as an adult. If he couldn't even use a revolver properly then, it wouldn't just be a matter of face. His life might be in danger. Charles chose the indoor shooting range because he was worried that poor marksmanship would damage his glorious image. A person's reputation is like a tree's shadow. Carrying a bad reputation makes one less comfortable. Arm hanging naturally, eyes on the sights, Dominic stood behind Charles, looked him over, and then ordered, "Fire." Bang. Still no hit. 20 meters and still no hit? Dominic discovered the problem. "Colonel, try to keep the force steady when you pull the trigger, otherwise it's easy to wobble at the moment of firing." "Understood," Charles replied. But it wasn't Charles's fault. The trigger was a bit heavy. This is a characteristic of revolvers. Pulling the trigger not only drives the hammer but also rotates the cylinder, resulting in a long trigger travel and heavy force, which isn't very friendly to a miner like Charles. Reloading the revolver, an image flashed through Charles's mind. He often saw policemen in movies holding their guns with both hands while firing. Would that suit him better? Thinking this, Charles placed his left hand on his right to stabilize the gun and began firing repeatedly at the target. Bang, bang, bang. He got the hang of it, hitting the target with 2 bullets. Then, he fired a few more bang, bang shots, finishing off the remaining bullets. All 3 hit the target, and 1 even hit the bullseye. Charles felt a continuity in this rapid firing. If the previous shot missed or went astray, he subconsciously made minor adjustments. As long as he wasn't frantically pulling the trigger like a machine gun, he had a sense of control over the rhythm. Dominic, standing to the side, was quite surprised. After a long while, he exclaimed in astonishment, "Why, Colonel, why are you shooting like that? Is there a problem?" Charles asked, thinking it was an incorrect posture. No, there's no problem," Dominic replied. "It's just that this method is very novel. I've never seen this shooting posture before." "Did you invent it yourself?" Charles then understood. In this era, there was no such shooting method of holding a gun with both hands. Everyone used a one-handed grip, like a cowboy in the West. Note, the Weaver's pistol shooting with both hands appeared in 1959. A sheriff in California created this shooting posture to win a shooting competition, and ended up beating a group of people who relied on luck for their accuracy. "I guess so," Charles said somewhat guiltily, adding, It was just a sudden inspiration. Dominic swallowed hard, his eyes flashing with a strange light as he looked at Charles. He was a test gunner, someone who had spent his entire life dealing with guns. He immediately recognized the advantages of this shooting posture: minimal exposure, rapid positioning, good stability, and excellent aiming. This was especially beneficial on the battlefield, where speed was paramount, and speed often meant survival. And this, Charles had inadvertently invented? He had only practiced it for a little over half an hour, and hadn't even fired a gun before. Sadly, Dominic hadn't considered changing it all these years, all was adhering to the standard shooting posture, over and over again. Dominic was confused. Was he being too foolish, or was Charles being too clever? The image above shows Weaver in a match. Thanks to Laloip, Little Tebeo Longan, and Blooming Popcorn for the generous donations. Chapter 229: Greavy's Crushing Defeat. The image below is a schematic diagram of the level magazine, with bullets connected end-to-end inside the tubular magazine. Next, Charles tried out the rifle. As a colonel, he would likely use a rifle on the battlefield, so learning was essential. He quickly discovered that the level rifle was equally unfriendly to beginners. This thing used a tubular magazine. Unlike other guns where ammunition is loaded vertically into the magazine, the level rifle loaded horizontally, one round after another. Although it held 8 rounds, seemingly a large capacity, it affected the feel of the weapon. Because the gun's center of gravity shifted slightly after each round, it felt like he was holding a different rifle each time, which confused Charles. He practiced for a while but couldn't figure it out. It was only easier to fire from a fixed position, but such positions weren't always readily available on the battlefield. Furthermore, Charles felt a sense of dread every time he pulled the trigger. The bullets in the magazine were connected end to end. What if a bullet bounced and hit the one in front? Would it accidentally discharge? That's enough for today, Charles complained, turning to Dominic to express his gratitude. Thank you, Instructor Dominic. You're welcome, Colonel, Dominic replied with a smile. It's a pleasure to help, he then added. It would be best if you practiced again tomorrow, Colonel. We need to reinforce our skills. Yes, sir. Charles waved goodbye. After Charles left, Dominic drew his pistol and aimed at the target, mentally recalling Charles's grip, adjusting his posture as he went. Bang, 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 bang. All 6 bullets hit the bullseye precisely. God, Dominic exclaimed in surprise and delight. That feels great, much faster than before. After a moment's thought, Dominic repeated the shooting posture, marveling. This grip should be promoted throughout the army. It's very useful. Suddenly, applause rang out nearby. Dominic looked towards the sound and saw it was Greavy. Hello, Greavy, Dominic asked with a puzzled look. What brings you here? I just came to see an old classmate. How are you, Dominic? Greavy strolled over. Of course, Dominic replied. Nothing's wrong. Greavy smiled and shook his head. The second son of Saint Etienne, actually willing to be a test shooter, and now an instructor, and he's enjoying it. Otherwise, Dominic answered while loading bullets into his revolver. Everyone has their own pursuits. Your pursuit is politics. Mine is guns. Greavy raised an eyebrow, watching Dominic demonstrate the shooting posture again and again, seemingly worried about forgetting it. Bang 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 bang, bang bang, all 6 bullets hit the bullseye once again. Your marksmanship has improved. Greavy's eyes showed some surprise. No, Dominic replied excitedly, it's this shooting posture. It allows me to shoot faster and more steadily. Oh, really? Greavy complimented. You invented it? That's fantastic. No, not me. Dominic's face showed a hint of embarrassment. It was Charles. He invented this gun-holding posture. Then, Dominic continued, unbelievable. I started practicing shooting when I was 11, and I've never thought of changing my gun-holding posture. Greavy's expression changed. He, who had been chatting and laughing just moments before, instantly fell silent. Dominic looked at Greavy with suspicion. You don't seem to like Charles very much? Greavy smiled slightly. He knew Dominic's habits. This guy cared about almost nothing except practicing shooting, so he didn't know much about the outside world, and of course, he didn't know about his relationship with Charles. Greavy didn't answer. He was silent for a while, then asked abruptly, have you considered your future, Dominic? What do you mean? Dominic answered casually, still practicing his gun posture, hoping to find the best angle. The future of Saint Etienne. Greavy's tone softened, and your own. These things are perhaps not for me to consider too much. Dominic reloaded his pistol, trying to aim at the simulated enemy. No, Greavy dutifully took a few steps back, distancing himself. You may not know, but your father is cooperating with Charles. He's even following Charles's orders, and the profits are split 50-50. Dominic stopped what he was doing, turning to look at Greavy, his face growing cold. I think you've already noticed. Greavy raised his head slightly. For example, grenades, mortars, and those small artillery pieces. If this continues, is this your intention? Dominic interrupted Greavy. To sow discord between Saint Etienne and Charles? Or to make me hate Charles? Greavy couldn't continue. Having been classmates for years, Greavy knew Dominic's character. Although he wasn't particularly clever, once he decided Charles was a good person, he wouldn't easily change his mind. Greavy had arrived too late. Never mind, Greavy said, shrugging to save face. You'll find out later. Before he could finish, Dominic pulled the trigger on the target. Bang! 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 Every bullet hit the bullseye with pinpoint accuracy. You'd better get out of here, Greavy, Dominic warned expressionlessly. Otherwise, it'll be your turn next time. Greavy raised an eyebrow. Suit yourself. This was Greavy's most humiliating defeat. Back when he was studying at Henry IV, he had used a series of methods to convince Dominic of his abilities as a strategist. Just now, Greavy had been confident he could persuade Dominic, but this was the outcome. Bang! 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 Several more gunshots rang out behind him. Greavy paused, gritted his teeth, and quickened his pace. Dominic stared at the target with a strange expression. One shot had missed the bullseye. This was due to distraction, not Greavy's fault. A scene flashed through his mind. In the officers' club, when he was being teased by a group of officers, a young lieutenant bravely stopped them. Enough. Give the letter back to him, instructor. An instructor jogged up to Dominic. Mr. Steed requests your presence at the Ritz Hotel. Dominic frowned and grunted in response. Could it be some kind of social engagement? His father knew perfectly well that he disliked such things. The image above shows the Henry IV School of Higher Education, a noble school founded in 1791. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 230 Shayosha Machine Gun? In the conference room of the Ritz Hotel, Charles briefly described the requirements for the aerial bombs to Steed, including the fuses. The fuses for aerial bombs had to be different. If they were like ordinary artillery shells, with a trigger fuse at the front, a serious problem could arise. The wind on the aircraft was too strong, and once the safety was released, the powerful wind could cause the bombs to collide with each other or even directly trigger the fuses, detonating them. This was one of the reasons why bombs were rarely carried on aircraft for bombing missions during this period. If they were usually dropped manually at low speed, and even then, accidents were still possible. The solution was to use a unique windmill-type trigger fuse for aerial bombs. This involved attaching a small propeller to the tail fin. When the safety was released, the small propeller would start rotating due to the wind, but it wouldn't explode at this point. After the bomb was dropped, the propeller would continue to rotate with the wind until the explosives hit the ground, lost wind power, and stopped rotating or rotated very slowly, at which point the bomb would detonate with a boom. The image above is from the movie Pearl Harbor. The Japanese bomb used a windmill-type trigger fuse, and the red circle shows a small rotating windmill. This method ensures both the safety of the aircraft and the explosion of the bomb upon landing, hence the name windmill-type trigger fuse. This is classified, Charles said to Steed. The technicians and workers who produce this bomb must undergo rigorous vetting. No problem, Colonel, Steed replied confidently. Leave it to me, we'll have it made soon. The St. Etienne arsenal has a very mature management system. Their level of secrecy is even higher than that of the military and government. After all, this concerns the interests of the capitalists themselves. However, I might be in trouble, Colonel, Steed said, looking troubled. I know you're busy, and perhaps I shouldn't bother you with such trivial matters, but, what trouble? Charles asked. It's like this. Steed habitually took out a cigar, but after glancing at Charles, he immediately put it back. Do you know the Pito Arsenal? I've heard of it, Charles nodded. It was originally an arms factory that mainly produced machine tools, Steed said. It made tools and equipment for us. But now it started producing rifles, specifically Berthier rifles. Berthier rifle, Charles had heard the name, but couldn't quite place it. Yes, Steed explained. It's a shortened version of the Lebel rifle, originally intended for cavalry. Charles said oh, and then he remembered. The French Lebel rifle was unsuitable for cavalry due to its loading defects, so a cavalry version was developed. This version not only had a shorter barrel, but its tubular loading system was also changed to vertical loading, although it could only hold 3 rounds due to the tapered bullet. Unexpectedly, this cavalry version became very popular with the infantry. Everyone thought this neglected rifle, given to the colonial forces by the government, was far superior to the original Lebel. This shows how unpopular the tubular loading system of the Lebel rifle was. It was a disaster for recruits who had only a few weeks of training before going to war, including Charles. They originally intended for Remington Arms in the U.S. to improve it, making it more suitable for infantry combat, Steed continued. But now they've handed the task over to the Pitot Arms factory. Charles was somewhat surprised. Considering both proficiency and scale, the improvement work should have been given to the Saint Etienne Arms factory. Steed added, "It said this is the result of Schneider's machinations." Charles understood immediately. Schneider would suppress anyone who cooperated with Charles. This not only limited Charles's development space but also served as a warning against cooperating with him. Fundamentally, this wasn't about Saint Etienne, but a battle between Charles and Schneider. Steed said worriedly, "It said the Pitot Arms factory is also developing a new machine gun. You know, the Saint Etienne Arms factory's foundation is rifles and machine guns. If the Lebel rifles and machine guns are all taken by the Pitot Arms factory, then Saint Etienne would no longer be Saint Etienne." Charles understood what this meant. Because Saint Etienne has the production foundation and capability, whether it's bombs, grenades, or 37mm mortars, as long as the blueprints are provided or the requirements are briefly described to Steed, Saint Etienne can produce them in a short time. This isn't just about money, or just about machines, it also involves skilled workers and related personnel, a complete system of talent. If Saint Etienne loses orders for rifles and machine guns, these workers and personnel will leave, and then the manufacturing capacity will be lost. "So, you want a more advanced rifle?" Charles asked. "Having a rifle is certainly good," Steed replied, "but we urgently hope to produce a machine gun. In fact, we are already developing a machine gun, but we haven't been able to solve its defects." This was after Saint Etienne's machine gun was phased out. As the owner of the Saint Etienne arsenal, Steed naturally had to consider the upgrade of the machine gun rather than letting others steal this piece of the pie. "Then, what about the machine gun?" Charles asked. "Wait a moment, Colonel." Steed glanced towards the door. "I'm very sorry, but I had my son bring the machine gun. He's an expert in this area, and I think he'll be able to explain things to you more clearly." A moment later, there was a knock at the door, and then Dominic walked in carrying a long case. Charles looked at him suspiciously. "Instructor, what are you doing here?" Looking at the long case in Dominic's hand, Charles suddenly understood. Dominic was the son Steed had mentioned. Dominic was also surprised to see Charles. Steed had only told him that he was bringing a machine gun, not that he was coming to see Charles. Steed paused for a moment. "You two know each other, of course, father," Dominic said with a smile. "You've forgotten, I'm an instructor at the police training base." Steed nodded with a no. Dominic was in charge of training with mortars, 37mm mortars, and a series of other weapons, all of which Charles had invented. Of course, they had met. However, Steed still introduced, "My son, Dominic, doesn't have many hobbies, except for guns." Dominic blushed slightly, remembering the incident at the officers' club. Thankfully Charles seemed to have no recollection of it. Steed shrugged, and Dominic finally realized, quickly placing the long case on the conference table, opening it, and taking out a machine gun. As he unfolded it, he introduced it with great familiarity. "This is our newly developed machine gun, using 8mm liberal ammunition, the same as rifles, with a 20-round capacity." Seeing this machine gun, Charles felt a little dizzy. The Chausa, known as the worst machine gun? Chapter 231 Improvements to Shayosha. Charles groaned inwardly. How could this machine gun be modified? Modifying it would practically mean redesigning an entire machine gun, wouldn't it? It was flawed in every way, but because of the sudden outbreak of war and the shortage of light machine guns in various countries, it still received a certain number of orders. However, The battlefield's assessment of it was, it's normal for it to malfunction. If it breaks down, just throw it away. It's not worth bringing back for repairs. This isn't a machine gun. It's at most a rifle capable of automatic fire. Charles stared at the machine gun for a while, then looked up and asked Dominic, tell me about its flaws. The biggest problem is that the barrel overheats after firing just over 200 rounds, Dominic said, pointing to the barrel. Although we've installed heat sinks, they don't really help much. Charles smiled and shook his head. That's not the biggest problem, Dominic. You don't even need to worry about that. What? Dominic looked up at Charles in confusion. Charles didn't answer. He pointed to the sickle-shaped magazine below the machine gun and asked, a hollow design? Yes, Dominic nodded. To reduce the weight of the machine gun, do you know what that means on the battlefield? Charles said calmly. The battlefield is full of dirty water, sand, and many other things we can't even imagine. They'll enter the magazine through the hollow part, then be carried by the bullets into the bolt, and then, the rest is self-explanatory, jamming. Dominic was stunned. He hadn't considered this point, but Charles's reminder made it clear. Their testing environment was too clean, and the operation was very standardized. They even performed maintenance before the test. If used in actual combat, it might really be as Charles said, it wouldn't even be able to fire more than 200 rounds before the barrel overheats. Dominic said somewhat dejectedly, but it already weighs 9 kilograms. If we don't reduce the magazine weight, we might lose the purpose of a light machine gun. Charles understood what he meant. A magazine with or without a perforation might seem to make little difference, but the key difference lies in its limited capacity, only 20 rounds per magazine. A machine gun, on the other hand, needs to carry 200 or 300 rounds, resulting in a dozen or so magazines. The difference becomes significant when carrying them. If a light machine gun requires 3 or more men, it's better to equip a heavy machine gun. Charles paced around the machine gun, observing it for a while, and concluded that it had two particularly prominent drawbacks. First, barrel cooling. The materials used at the time were subpar. The barrel overheated after firing 200 rounds. Adding a cooling fin only increased the firing range by a few dozen rounds, offering little practical benefit in adding weight, a waste. Second, the taper of French bullets. Their distinctive large taper inevitably resulted in a semi-sickle shape for the magazine, a feature that couldn't be changed. After a moment's thought, Charles reached a conclusion. He calmly said, perhaps we should remove the heat sink. Remove the heat sink, Dominic exclaimed. Then we can only fire 200 rounds. We can design the barrel to be replaceable, Charles said, pointing to the junction of the barrel and receiver. Around here, we can design a barrel lock, and add a carrying handle to the barrel. When the barrel gets hot, you can use the handle to change it, and so on. Modern machine guns widely use this design. Some can change barrels in just 5 seconds. Dominic and Steed exchanged bewildered glances. A design like that? But it did seem feasible. It wasn't about focusing on heat dissipation, it was about direct replacement. When one barrel got hot, it was replaced. When that one got hot again, the other barrel had cooled down, allowing for repeated replacements. This would provide a level of sustained firepower unmatched by ordinary light machine guns. Great idea, Steed nodded in approval. In terms of manufacturing, it was simply a matter of adding a barrel lock to secure the gun body together, yet it solved a major problem. The magazine problem. Charles removed the magazine from the machine gun and examined it, saying, if it has to be a semi-scythe shape like this, why not just design it as a disc? A disc? Dominic's eyes widened. Yes, Charles saw another magazine in the long box and took it, combining the two, a disc shape, a fully enclosed design, made of lightweight metal as much as possible. This would reduce weight and perhaps allow for more rounds. Charles was inspired by the DP-28 rotary machine gun. This disc could effectively accommodate the taper of level rifle cartridges. Since the bullets rotated one after another inside, the taper issue wasn't a major concern. Dominic stared at Charles in shock. This might solve the magazine problem, but how do we install this rotary magazine? Steed had the same question. They had considered this method, but if it rotated to form a disc, where would they put it? Without the slightest hesitation, Charles patted the top of the receiver and said, mount it here. Make a loading port below the disc, and load the bullets from top to bottom. Before they knew it, Charles had modified the machine gun to resemble a big plate chicken, a type of Chinese fast-firing machine gun. Dominic and Steed exchanged glances. both seeing excited astonishment in each other's eyes. Steed was alright. He had known about Charles's design talent all along, which was why he had sought his help at this time. But Dominic thought Charles wouldn't be of much help. After all, Charles had only just started handling guns. How could he have been practicing shooting an hour ago and then casually solved a machine gun problem an hour later? He hadn't even touched a machine gun trigger. But the facts were undeniable. Charles offered several invaluable ideas, changing the barrel and using a sealed magazine. Although replacing two sickle-shaped magazines with a single-disc magazine wouldn't significantly change the weight, the sustained firepower increased from 20 rounds to 40 rounds or even more, which was still a leap forward. A brilliant idea, Colonel. Dominic excitedly shook Charles's hand. I never imagined you had such a deep understanding of firearms. I think we will have many more opportunities to cooperate in the future. Steed smiled with satisfaction. Dominic had never been impressed by anyone when it came to firearms, but now he was completely in awe of Charles. Of course, Charles nodded. Watching Dominic pack up the machine gun, Charles frowned and turned to Steed, saying, we might be able to make this machine gun's original design work. A hint of confusion flashed in Steed's eyes. It can still work, Charles hummed in agreement. If you have a way to leak it to the Pitto Arms factory. Steed instantly understood Charles's intention, and he smiled meaningfully. Of course, Colonel, of course I have a way. Chapter 232 Christmas is coming. Problematic designs should naturally be left to the competitors. Steed's approach was simple. Factories often had designers who, relying on their knowledge of St. Etienne's secrets, assumed Steed wouldn't dare fire them. Steed did indeed have such concerns, often turning a blind eye to their violations and laziness, which only emboldened them. Now, Steed saw this as an opportunity to clean things up. Of course, before firing them, Steed would have them sign confidentiality agreements or something similar, even outlining compensation for any leaks, convincing these designers that the information they possessed was valuable. The Chochet machine gun design would undoubtedly end up in the hands of the Pitto Arms factory. But that was exactly what Steed wanted. Steed could even imagine the Pitto Arms factory's reaction upon seeing the design. Lacking design experience and talent, they might be collecting machine guns from around the world to disassemble and study, then trying to build their own. Suddenly, a mature machine gun design appeared before them. They would be overjoyed, rushing to register industrial property rights and then purchasing machines for mass production as quickly as possible, because only in this way could they beat the St. Etienne arsenal. Unfortunately, they didn't realize that St. Etienne was not on the same level as them. Their machine guns were produced for only one purpose, to be ruthlessly trampled underfoot by St. Etienne, becoming mere foils to the victors. Steed was quite satisfied with this scenario, further solidifying his belief. Supporting Charles's choice was correct. No one could defeat Charles, whether on the battlefield or in equipment design. Because he was the one who understood war best, and possessed the talent in that area. Before leaving, Charles gave Steed another piece of advice. It's time to develop a new bullet, Steed. Only then can you possibly reclaim the rifle market. Steed suddenly realized. Charles was right. Everything was because of bullets. The Lebel tubular magazine was because of bullets, the Bertier's mere 3-round capacity was because of bullets, and the Chochet machine gun's sickle-shaped magazine design was also because of bullets. All the design flaws stemmed from the excessive cone angle of the bullets, so why not address the root cause? Steed gripped Charles's hand tightly, excitedly saying, "Thank you so much, Colonel. I know what to do." He truly knew what to do. It was simple, just copy the bullets used by the German Mauser rifles. What could the Mauser company do during wartime? Besides, the Germans were also copying St. Etienne's grenades and mortars. Steed wanted to say something cheesy. You are our direction, our future, Colonel. With you here, we are invincible. But thinking that seemed inappropriate for his age, he ultimately hid his flattery and excitement in his eyes. Charles received a 3-day leave, his first since joining the army. The leave was granted by Galini, who smiled at Charles and said, "Merry Christmas." Charles was startled, realizing that Christmas had arrived in Europe. "Merry Christmas," Charles replied. This feeling was somewhat strange. As a transmigrator, Charles usually celebrated the spring festival, but this was not the case here. On the car ride back to Darvaz, Charles watched the swirling snowflakes outside with curiosity. Before this, Charles had always thought hexagonal snowflakes only existed in fairy tales and comic books, something idealized. Now he realized they were real, falling right before his eyes. Charles, Just as Charles was wondering how they formed, he heard someone call his name from afar. Turning his head, he saw a group of teenagers chasing and playing under the sycamore trees by the roadside. They had been throwing snowballs at each other and noticed Charles's car, stopping to wave and even inviting him to join them. Charles recognized them as his classmates, including Teddy, and quickly turned back to wave back. "Hello." Laurent turned and gently asked, "Should we stop, Colonel?" Charles hesitated for a moment before replying, "No, Major, I have other things to do." Actually, Charles had plenty of free time and wanted to be with them, but he found himself unable to fit into this carefree group, even though he was about their age. And they, Charles's former classmates, would feel immense pressure if Charles actually joined them in playing. Charles could even imagine the bizarre scene, snowballs miraculously refusing to hide him, his classmates all cautiously glancing at the revolver at Charles's waist, and Major Laurent standing by watching everything. So, it was best to keep his distance. The car slowly stopped in front of Joka's cottage. Joka and Camille were decorating the Christmas tree inside and came out to greet Charles when they saw his car. "Merry Christmas." Camille opened his arms and gave Charles a hug, a proud and happy smile on his face. Joka greeted Laurent, "Would you like a glass of wine, Major? Come inside and warm up." "No, Mr. Joka," Laurent declined. "I should go to the factory. Those bastards are always giving me trouble." Joka didn't insist and waved to Laurent, who was turning around, calling out, "Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas." Major Laurent responded. Joka added, "Tell them I'll put Christmas presents in the security room. Everyone gets one." "Thank you very much, Mr. Joka," Laurent turned around and replied. As the car sped up, Major Laurent thought to himself, they were all good people, conscientious capitalists. French capitalists should all be like them. This was Joka's strength, his sentimental nature. He knew how to treat those around him kindly, his guards, neighbors, and employees. This trait would be a disaster for small capitalists. Small capitalists don't have the capital to treat others kindly. They would soon go bankrupt and then face the scorn of others, even those they had treated kindly before. But Charles was no longer a small capitalist. His assets had grown rapidly to over 20 million francs in just 3 months. Motorcycles, tractors, tanks, grenades, airplanes. This didn't even include the deposit for the Charles A1 tank and the 43.8275 million francs licensed production fee from the U.S. military. The former was because the French military was short of funds and hoped that the Charles tractor factory could deliver first, pay later. The latter is because the U.S. military needs to go through procedures, and the payment is expected to arrive in the next couple of days. Selling arms, especially weapons that can win wars, generates wealth at an unimaginable rate, and that rate is accelerating. With such an economic foundation, Charles needs a steward like Joka. Spending a small amount of money and giving small favors to others can earn him a good reputation. Why not? Chapter 233 Merry Christmas. In Ypres, Belgium, the already perpetually dark sky gradually darkened. The weather grew increasingly cold, the once damp, muddy ground had frozen solid, a shovel strike only producing a tiny white dot. Captain Claude hoped to dig a ladder into the trench wall so he could more easily peek out and assess the situation. But he ultimately gave up, tossing down his entrenching tool and crawling into the trench, rubbing his hands and complaining, "We can probably only hope the German shells will finish those damn fortifications for us." The soldiers huddled in the trench laughed, passing their remaining cigarettes in the dim, flickering candlelight. One advantage of winter was that fortifications became much harder, often freezing German artillery, thus reducing the intensity of the battle. Or perhaps, after more than 3 months of fighting, they had grown weary, having initially thought the war would end quickly. Lieutenant Dennis handed Captain Claude a newspaper. "Take a look at this, it might warm you up." Captain Claude took the newspaper, shivering, and unfolded it towards the candle. He squinted at it and saw that it read, "The Charles will distribute 10,000 quilts to the soldiers at the front before Christmas." "That's certainly good news," Captain Claude said, but his reaction was flat. "There are too many men at the front. If this troop is assigned to us, we might only have a few scraps left." The soldiers laughed again. "Charles is a good officer. He always brings victories to France. He also sends us supplies, without fail, but he's all alone. The other capitalists see him as an enemy and a rival, just because he's different from others." No, Captain Claude shook his head. "You fools." Looking at his puzzled subordinates, Captain Claude explained, You think the other capitalists see Charles as an enemy simply because he's different from others, then why? What else do you know, Captain? The soldiers curiously gathered around. In the boring, arduous, and dangerous tunnels, fresh and interesting topics were always the most popular. Captain Claude didn't answer but asked in return, think about it. Capitalists would rather pour out milk than leave it for the hungry. Do you know why? The soldiers were stumped. They knew that capitalists did indeed do that, but they didn't know why. This was indeed absurd. On one hand, capitalists were dumping unsold milk into the river, and on the other hand, people were starving to death. Why not give the milk to those who were starving? That would even earn them a good reputation. Captain Claude replied in a low voice, the reason is simple. Among those starving people, perhaps 1% could afford milk, or 100 people could pool their money to buy a cup. But if the capitalists gave the milk away, they wouldn't need to buy it. And once the demand pressure decreases, the already exorbitant milk price will fall further, which would be working against themselves. The soldiers suddenly realized that would prevent them from making money. It's disgusting. These capitalists are actually watching people starve to death for such a small amount of money. They only think about making money. Other people losing their lives is the problem. Soon they thought of Charles again, and someone asked, but what does this have to do with Charles? Captain Claude simply hummed in response, smiling without answering. Soon, someone thought, Charles is using his own money to give away large quantities of supplies to the front lines for free, which will reduce the demand there. Yes, this prevents capitalists from raising prices and making them lose money. God, the capitalists are against Charles because of his good deeds. A chorus of curses against the capitalists and sympathy for Charles immediately erupted from the tunnel. Suddenly, Captain Claude gave an urgent order, silence. Silence. The soldiers fell silent instantly, then, at the captain's command, grabbed their weapons and rushed out of the tunnel, spreading out and preparing for battle in front of the trenches, assuming the enemy would launch a surprise attack. But upon closer listening, they heard a faint singing coming from the darkness opposite. Lieutenant Dennis cautiously peeked out and listened for a moment, then with a strange look on his face when he pulled back, the Germans are celebrating Christmas. These bastards, what a memorable Christmas. May they have many more Christmases to come. The soldiers chuckled softly, but their laughter was tinged with bitterness, for they too were experiencing this memorable Christmas. Someone jokingly rolled up their sleeve and shouted across the trench, "Hey, Germans, Merry Christmas!" This humorous act drew laughter from the surrounding soldiers, with one quipping, "André, your words are more effective than cannon fire." However, a reply of Merry Christmas came from the darkness on the other side, in French. Then, more and more shouts of Merry Christmas came, some clearly newly learned, their pronunciation distorted. Captain Claude realized that Germans had taken his men's humor seriously. But why couldn't it be real? "Merry Christmas," Captain Claude shouted, his voice sincere. The soldiers hesitated for a moment, then joined in, shouting Merry Christmas. Soon, a small light appeared on the German side, bright at first but quickly dimming. The French soldiers, however, could see clearly that it was a Christmas tree, decorated with candles, but most of the light extinguished as soon as it emerged from the trench, leaving only a tiny spark. God, it was a German officer shielding his eyes from the fierce wind. The French soldiers should have fired. It was the enemy, and an officer at that, exposed in the firelight, his upper body completely overhanging the trench, only 100 meters away. A single shot would be fatal. But no one fired. A tacit understanding seemed to have formed. The German officer shouted across, "Is everything all right, Frenchman? We're freezing to death." Captain Claude chuckled, understanding the German officer's humor. "We don't need you to deal with us, just wait for us to freeze to death. Everything's fine, Germans," Captain Claude replied. "We'll just see who lasts the longest, won't we?" Both sides laughed. Then everyone understood, in this situation, there seemed to be no need to kill each other. Humans have an innate tendency to unite in times of crisis and hardship. Christmas was merely the catalyst. At first, they shouted and chatted across the trenches, but soon some dared to venture into the no-man's land in the middle to exchange gifts. This action was like opening Pandora's box. More and more people exchanged gifts, cigarettes, candy, chocolates, you name it. Finally, they even invited each other to their trenches for a drink, the atmosphere perfectly harmonious. Chapter 234 Ceasefire for 48 hours. In the town of Darvaz, every house was lit up, the Christmas trees adorned with colorful lights constantly changing colors, and laughter echoed from within. The Charles family was no exception. He had received a very special gift, a horse. It was a real horse, and Joka and Camille had begun preparations for this day 2 weeks in advance. They had bought their neighbor Daniel's storage room, converted it into a stable, and even hired Mrs. Daniel for 30 francs a month to care for the horse. Charles had seen the horse that afternoon. It was pure white and very strong, its hooves making a clear, melodious sound. Joka had fitted it with a beautiful set of brand new, gleaming tack. Charles had even tried climbing on its back and riding around. Charles understood Joka and Camille's intentions. After this Christmas, Charles would be an adult, and he might have to go to war. But Charles hadn't learned to ride a horse yet, which was a major problem for a commander. What if the troops were trapped and there was a horse nearby, but Charles didn't know how to ride? Charles wanted to tell them that in an era with cars, motorcycles, sidecars, and even airplanes, escaping on horseback was often more dangerous than on foot, especially when the rider was an officer. However, Charles didn't say it, because that would disappoint their good intentions. At that moment, Charles's family was enjoying Christmas dinner, roast turkey, foie gras, cream cake, smoked fish, a sumptuous and delicious meal, except for the turkey, which Charles found hard to describe. It wasn't that Camille's cooking was bad, but the meat was dry and tough, requiring a strong bite. Charles thought it wasn't really suitable for roasting. "This has been a magical year," Joka said happily, having had a few extra drinks and basking in a bit of intoxication. Just a few months ago, Charles was a high school student, and now look at him. Joka raised his glass to Charles. He's already a colonel, a hero. It all feels like a dream. Camille glanced at Charles with a proud smile, raised his glass, and said, "For Charles, for Charles." Joka responded with a toast, and the two drank it down in one gulp. Charles glanced at the wine glass still on the table. They seemed to have ignored him. Just then, the sound of car brakes came from outside. Joka and Camille's expressions changed. They could tell from the sound that it was Laurent, and Laurent coming at this time usually meant trouble. Camille frowned and muttered softly, "They wouldn't be after Charles now." Joka stopped Camille with a look, getting up and opening the door before Laurent could knock. Laurent rushed in, hurriedly nodding apologetically to Joka and Camille, his anxious gaze finally settling on Charles. "Emergency. Colonel, the general wants you back at headquarters immediately." Charles was puzzled. Had the Germans launched an attack? At this time? When Charles was in the car, he realized he was completely wrong. It wasn't the Germans attacking, nor the French. It was a ceasefire. The entire front had ceased fighting. At the Paris City Defense Command, the command center was silent. This wasn't because they were lazy, but because they had nothing to do. They hadn't received any telegrams from the front for hours. Even when they did, they were just perfunctory. Everything is normal. Galini, however, wasn't worried. He leisurely sipped his coffee and, seeing Charles walk up the stairs, put down his cup and said, "Sorry to have called you here, Colonel, but it concerns the Meritorious Service newspaper. I heard there's a ceasefire," Charles asked. "Yes," Galini nodded in reply. "We're not sure where it started, but it spread like a plague along the entire front. Hundreds of kilometers of the front are silent, without a single gunshot or artillery blast. The communications officers are unwilling to report what's happening. Some simply say radio malfunction. We've lost command and communication with the front." Charles glanced at Cobdo, who was buried in a pile of newspapers at his desk. The implication was clear. He was worried Cobdo might be calling for a ceasefire in the newspapers. No small matter. "No, Colonel." Cobdo stood up. "Don't worry, I've checked the newspapers from the last 10 days. They haven't said anything." Charles nodded, slightly relieved. "You must understand, Colonel." Galleri tapped his fingers lightly on the table. "It's the commander-in-chief who's dissatisfied with the current situation. He's furious. We've received intelligence that an unofficial agreement may have been reached at the front, and the soldiers intend to take a 48-hour ceasefire." Charles found this quite interesting. He even thought that perhaps the two governments could use this opportunity to sit down and negotiate, to properly discuss why they were fighting this war, or whether a ceasefire was possible. For example, the Germans could withdraw to their own country, and Britain and France could refrain from further retaliation. If World War I ended this way, it would obviously be much better than the eventual deaths of millions. But clearly, this was impossible. Although the soldiers on both sides didn't want to fight, the High Command, who didn't have to sacrifice or fight, didn't think so. They all believed they could defeat the enemy and gain enormous benefits from it. The commander-in-chief believes it's time for the Meritorious Service Gazette to play its part, Gallieni said, looking at Charles with a complex expression. He wants you to speak out in the Meritorious Service Gazette and get them to abolish this ridiculous ceasefire agreement. Charles refused without hesitation. No, I won't do that, Gallieni sighed, then emphasized, that's an order, Colonel. General Cobbo jumped up, that won't work at all, and it will only ruin the Meritorious Service Gazette. Cobbo then explained, the Meritorious Service Gazette is a newspaper. It should always be on the side of the soldiers. Only then can it gain their trust and their acceptance of its propaganda. If we use it as a tool of the military, blatantly issuing orders to the soldiers at the front, they will quickly boycott the Meritorious Service Gazette. It will be meaningless, just a piece of paper. Gallieni nodded slightly in agreement. He seemed to understand the true intention behind the commander-in-chief's order, to strike at the Meritorious Service Gazette and even Charles himself at this time. If Charles were to step forward now to call on the soldiers to fight, they would also resent him. But this was an order. Just as Gallieni was struggling with this dilemma, Charles spoke up. I have a different opinion, General, Charles replied calmly. I am very willing to carry out the commander-in-chief's orders, but I think the one who spoke should be the commander-in-chief. He is the commander-in-chief of France. If he cannot rally the soldiers to fight, who can? Gallieni's eyes lit up. He knew how to answer Joffre. Chapter 235 Slaughter Order. Gallieni called Joffre. Yes, General. They will resolutely carry out your orders, but we all agree that it is more appropriate for you to speak. After all, you are the commander-in-chief of France. No, that's no problem. Our reporters have your photos, and we can publish your words and photos in the newspaper as long as you allow it. Yes, you don't need to come to Paris in person. Charles can also do it, but our reporters think. Gallieni glanced at Cobbo standing to the side, and continued, our reporters think it's not appropriate for the two of you to appear in the newspaper together. It would give the impression that Colonel Charles is just as important as the commander-in-chief. Charles' appeal can perhaps be postponed until tomorrow. Joffre angrily hung up the phone. He did indeed intend to use this opportunity to weaken Charles's military influence, because Charles put Joffre under considerable pressure. At this time, the military had basically abandoned the Saint-Chamond and CA-1 tanks, opting instead to order Charles's Charles A-1 tanks in full. In reality, the Saint-Chamond and CA-1 tanks weren't abandoned. Orders continued to be placed, but they were repurposed as auxiliary vehicles, such as troop transport and supply delivery. Although everyone knew that tractors were far superior for troop and supply transport compared to these vehicles that were constantly stuck in shell craters, they still needed to be given some work and to be used. However, the Char A-1 tank continued to achieve overwhelming victories on the front lines. The army only trusted the Char A-1 and the Mark I, rejecting all others. The Char A-1 was widely considered effective in assaulting enemy lines, while the Mark I, due to its superior trench-crossing capabilities, remained active on the battlefield. Many believe that when the Char A-1 couldn't cross enemy trenches, that was when the Mark I came into play. They complemented each other. In short, anything equipped by the Char was considered effective and capable of winning battles. They enjoyed the utmost trust from frontline soldiers, and any unit that acquired Char tanks would immediately experience a surge in morale. Conversely, if a unit was equipped with either the Saint-Chamond or the CA-1, they would feel they were being used as cannon fodder to die. This was not good news for Joffre, who was the representative, image ambassador, of the Saint-Chamond. Not long ago, he had been promoting the Saint-Chamond's power to everyone, emphasizing its invincibility. The reality was that even the craters and rocks on the battlefield made the Saint-Chamond difficult to maneuver, let alone compete with the devastating Charles A-1. Charles had challenged the power and authority of the commander-in-chief of France. If this continued, the frontline soldiers would be more willing to obey Charles's orders than as the commander-in-chief of France. Those troops fighting on the front lines didn't care about ranks, positions, or politics. They only knew who could save their lives and who could lead them to victory. That's who they would listen to. Just then, Joffre received news of a ceasefire at the front. The general headquarters was no longer able to command the front. Joffre immediately suspected Charles. Could this be his doing? Charles held the honors newspaper, and he was using his influence and the army's support to sideline Joffre as commander-in-chief. But a closer look revealed nothing wrong with the honors. An hour later, Keynes received feedback from the front. General, perhaps because of Christmas, Both sides seem to have grown weary of war, so, we cannot allow this to continue, Joffre abruptly interrupted Keynes, his voice righteous and firm. The Germans are still on French soil. A unilateral ceasefire will cause our army to lose its will to attack, and if this continues, defeat will be inevitable. But, Keynes said helplessly, we can't command anyone. To be precise, we can order the officers, but their orders are not being carried out. Joffre hesitated for a moment, then said, perhaps we can let Charles play a role. This led to Gallieri's urgent evacuation of Charles from the Christmas dinner table back to headquarters. Joffre's idea was brilliant, let Charles rally the soldiers. If successful, the French army would be back on track. Failure would be a blow to both Charles and the Gallery newspaper. Either outcome would be beneficial to Joffre. Unexpectedly, Gallieri skillfully passed the buck to Joffre. Joffre snorted and sat back down. Calling on the front lines in his name would be meaningless. Success would bring credit to the Gallery, while failure would be an insult to Joffre as commander-in-chief. But Joffre had no reason to object. Did he really want to admit that Charles had more influence than him, the commander-in-chief? Seeing Joffre's grim expression, Keynes suggested in a low voice, General, we can send men to the front lines to inspect and urge the soldiers to rejoin the battle. No, Joffre shook his head expressionlessly, stood up, pointed to Ypres on the map, and said in a low, slow voice, this is the source. Send in the infantry and gendarmes, and issue a levy for any troops that disobey orders. Note, during the Third French Republic, the gendarmes were divided into infantry and cavalry. The levy continued the Roman Republic's practice of conscription, where 1 out of 10 men was chosen for execution. The French Republic was more merciful, they allowed the troops to elect their own, and the proportion was not large. For details, see Paths of Glory, a film banned in France. Keynes was startled, frozen in place, staring at Joffre in disbelief. Joffre emphasized, execute the order. Yes, General, Keynes responded, turning tremblingly to issue the order. When the news reached the Paris garrison headquarters, Gallieri was stunned for a long time before reacting. France does indeed have this military regulation, intended to deter troops from disobeying orders, but it's generally not used unless the situation is urgent and has serious consequences. However, Gallieri doesn't believe the frontline troops' so-called disobedience has caused any real consequences, they simply want to skip Christmas. Charles was stunned upon hearing this. France actually has such an absurd military regulation? And to have the frontline troops elect a few people to carry out the executions? They think this will keep the troops' morale and fighting spirit, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand exclaimed indignantly. They don't care about these things, it's not them who will die. Charles considered for a moment, then said to Gallieri, General, I just bought a batch of turkeys as Christmas gifts. I'd like to send them to them and express my condolences. Please approve. Gallieri, of course, knew this was Charles's excuse. However, he didn't stop him. He simply said, this could be dangerous. Charles laughed, the front lines have ceased fighting, General. There's no danger. In fact, we'd like it to be dangerous. Gallieri hesitated for a moment, then nodded, all right, that day will come eventually. Chapter 236 Doomsday Carnival. The Ypres front was in high spirits. They lit rows of candles along the trenches, cleverly using entrenching tools to shield themselves from the wind. In the flickering candlelight, someone played the accordion, surrounded by a large group of soldiers, British, French, and German. They sang Christmas carols popular in various countries to the rhythm of the accordion. Those who didn't know the songs hummed along randomly, singing and dancing as they went, even sharing their treasured bottles of wine. In the no-man's land between the positions, on a relatively flat piece of land, the soldiers drew a football field, using torches as boundaries, barbed wire as goals, and a bundle of straw as the football. Two teams of players ran and competed joyfully on the field. Captain Claude acted as the referee, his whistle, originally used to signal attacks, perfectly transformed into a football whistle. He even made red and yellow cards out of paint. Watching the players sprinting on the field while the spectators cheered loudly, Captain Claude felt a pang of bitterness. He understood that this kind of happiness was nothing more than a doomsday celebration. Perhaps we'll die in fear and helplessness tomorrow, so why not just die from exhaustion now? That's a kind of happiness. This was perhaps a reflection of everyone's inner thoughts. Why had fate driven them to this point? At this moment, Lieutenant Dennis jogged over and stopped Captain Claude, who was following the players, and whispered a few words in his ear. Captain Claude's expression changed, and he nodded to the guards not far away. "Barry, come and take my place." Barry stepped forward and took the whistle from Captain Claude. Captain Claude hurriedly crawled into the tunnel serving as the command post. He shook hands with a thin soldier and asked expressionlessly, "Is what you said true? They're planning to issue a confiscation order against us?" "Yes," the soldier nodded. "The order has been issued to Dunkirk. They need some time to discuss this with the British, because the British troops are also involved, and they need to be reorganized simultaneously for it to be effective. Then, the soldier nervously suggested, "Captain, let's resume fighting." Captain Claude gently shook his head, interrupting the soldier. His tone was sarcastic. "If we resume fighting, how many people will die in 2 days?" Everyone fell silent. Based on the previous casualty rate, at least dozens would be killed or wounded in 2 days. A confiscation order, on the other hand, might only kill a dozen or so. Numerically, it seemed worthwhile. Captain Claude would naturally choose the confiscation order. Lieutenant Dennis panicked, "But a draft order is a disgrace to soldiers." "Captain, we'll lose everything." Captain Claude saw through it all. "What meaning does any of this have for a dead man?" "But who should we choose?" Lieutenant Dennis asked. The cruelest part of the draft order was that it forced the soldiers to choose their own executioners. "Count me in," Captain Claude replied calmly. Everyone froze. This was no honor, but the captain, as usual, charged ahead. Just as the tunnel fell into a tense atmosphere, a communications soldier suddenly rushed in excitedly. "Captain, do you know who's here?" "Who?" Lieutenant Dennis asked, a flicker of panic in his eyes. Had the infantry and military police arrived? The others in the tunnel also paled. But Captain Claude silently pulled a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. He seemed to have given himself a death sentence. He didn't care about anything anymore. It was just a few days sooner. "It's Charles." "Charles is here," the communications soldier exclaimed excitedly. "Can you believe it? Charles has come to inspect our area, and I heard he's even bringing us turkeys." A flicker of surprise crossed the eyes of those inside the tunnel, but they remained silent, all pondering the same question. Had they sent Charles to carry out the execution order? "What's wrong, guys?" the communications soldier asked, puzzled. "Nothing," Captain Claude replied expressionlessly. "Where is he?" "Take me to him." "Yes, Captain," the communications soldier responded. Before arriving, Charles did 2 things. First, he had Joko purchase roasted turkeys and arrange transportation to send them to Ypres in batches. Second, he contacted General Winter in Dunkirk, instructing him to delay the infantry and military police who were about to depart for Ypres. General Winter's actions were successful, and his reasoning was sound. The British troops also participated in the ceasefire. Without joint punishment, the effect might be minimal. Furthermore, while Ypres is part of the Allied defenses, it is Belgian territory. Should we consult His Majesty Albert I? Thus, this was no longer just a French issue, but an international one involving Britain and Belgium, making negotiations unlikely to be quick. Adding to the uncertainty of the night and concerns about a potential mutiny, the infantry and military police, after consulting with General Headquarters, decided to wait until dawn to take action. Charles arrived in Ypres around 5 a.m., without informing anyone at the front beforehand, taking only a guard platoon. Charles understood that informing the front beforehand would have been dangerous. The German military would have been overjoyed. The front was undefended, with soldiers from both sides freely entering enemy trenches, and Charles was actually inspecting the front at this time. They only needed to send a few assassins to the front lines to wait. Upon seeing Charles, they could simply raise their guns and kill him, thus restoring the state of war. Gallieri knew this too, and therefore strictly ordered everyone in command who knew the news not to step outside the command post. Telephones and telegrams were also under strict control. When Charles, along with Laurent and a squad of guards, appeared at the Ypres front, none of the passing soldiers recognized him. They even looked at these uninvited guests with suspicion. Charles walked along the trenches to the front lines. Passing a rest area, he saw a group of soldiers gathered near an accordion, singing and dancing by candlelight. There were German and French soldiers among them, their rifles casually placed aside or even mixed together. A drunken German officer approached and invited Charles into the dance floor. Laurent instinctively lunged forward, pushed him down, and drew his revolver, pointing it at the officer. The other guards, as if facing a formidable enemy, rushed forward, raising their rifles to protect Charles. "Herr, relax," a French soldier stepped forward from the crowd. "Merry Christmas, gentlemen. Just arrived, huh?" It's truce time, understand? Truce. Charles stepped forward and ordered Laurent and his guards to lower their guns. The French soldier looked Charles up and down with incredulous eyes. Hey, Colonel, you look a lot like Charles. I saw him once in Paris. God, exactly the same. Charles didn't speak, just stared quietly at the communications officer. The accordion music suddenly stopped, the noisy singing and dancing disappeared, the air seemed to freeze, and everyone's eyes were fixed on Charles, including the German officers and soldiers. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 237, A Win-Win Solution. The next second, the French soldiers cried out excitedly, God, you are Charles, you are Charles. The soldiers then realized what was happening and began to murmur amongst themselves, is he really Charles, the Charles who always helped us win battles? Yes, he even gave us a lot of supplies, including quilts. Then, the soldiers rushed forward to shake hands with Charles. It's a pleasure to meet you, Colonel. Thank you for the supplies and hope you gave us. You are a pride, Colonel. The German officer also stepped forward, saluted Charles, and shook hands with him with admiration, saying in broken French, you are a respectable enemy, Colonel. It's so lucky to see you in person. No, it's lucky to be alive to see you. The French soldiers laughed heartily, their laughter filled with pride. They understood what the German officer meant. A German soldier said something in German that the others couldn't understand. A German officer translated, Berger said that Charles has a nickname in our army. We call him the War Knight, meaning a knight born for war. The French soldiers exclaimed wow, in unison, and the next second they chanted in rhythmic unison, the War Knight. The War Knight. More and more soldiers gathered. Hearing that Charles had arrived at the front, they dropped what they were doing and rushed from all directions to join him, completely surrounding the trenches. Many German officers and soldiers also rushed over upon hearing the news, all wanting to see Charles in person. The French soldiers, however, instinctively grabbed their rifles, their eyes filled with vigilance, worried that the German soldiers might take advantage of this rare opportunity to harm Charles. A captain squeezed through the crowd, saluted Charles expressionlessly, and then politely stepped aside. Colonel, let's talk inside. Charles nodded and followed the captain, advancing along the trench amidst the cheers of the soldiers, before entering the captain's command post. I'm sorry, the conditions here are limited. The captain gestured for Charles to sit on a low stool, bent down to take a toothbrush cup from the shelf, and handed it to Charles, his tone apologetic. This is all I can offer you. The cup contained freshly heated coffee, made by mixing instant coffee with snow and then heating it with a candle. Charles thanked him, took a sip of his coffee, and said, it's all right, except for a slightly burnt taste. The captain laughed. You're very straightforward, Colonel. When those generals come to inspect, they either don't drink a drop or they pretend to say it tastes great, but their expressions don't reflect that. Charles calmly replied, if I were a general, I might do the same. The captain chuckled. He knew Charles wouldn't, because his influence far surpassed that of those so-called generals, unless he was unaware of this. The captain took a simple stool and sat down in front of Charles, asking, so, what is the purpose of your visit? Then he added, please forgive me, Colonel, but I have to speak to you from the soldier's perspective. Of course, Charles replied, I am also speaking to you from the soldier's perspective. You mean? The captain looked at Charles with a puzzled expression. At that moment, another cheer erupted outside the tunnel. Lieutenant Dennis entered and whispered something in the captain's ear. The captain nodded slightly. Thank you for the turkey, Colonel, the captain said expressionlessly. However, if you want the soldiers to abandon the ceasefire agreement because of this, I can't do it. Our agreements aren't like those of the higher-ups that can be torn up at will. Charles listened quietly to the captain's words, then replied unhurriedly, that was just a Christmas present, Captain. The captain grunted but said nothing, his expression a half smile, as if to say, we'll see. I don't believe you won't make any demands. Charles didn't care. He took another sip of coffee, looked up at the captain in the candlelight, and asked, you know about the execution order, right? The captain thought to himself, here it comes, he's trying to use this to threaten me. So what? The captain retorted. After a pause, the captain added, we won't compromise, Colonel. Although I appreciate your understanding and help, this won't work. Perhaps there's a way to have the best of both worlds, Charles interrupted the captain. What? The captain looked at Charles in confusion, not understanding what best of both worlds meant. War or ceasefire? How could this possibly be a win-win situation? They were contradictory. Charles leaned closer and lowered his voice. You can start the war, but no one will know where your bullets hit, Captain. You just need to make an agreement with the Germans to each put up a wooden sign in the trench as a target. The captain instantly understood. He nodded. Good idea, Colonel, an excellent idea. Then, the captain's gaze towards Charles softened, and his stern face relaxed like melting ice. Before this, the captain had always been wary of Charles, assuming he was a liaison sent by the generals. He didn't blame Charles, because it was Charles's duty. He was a soldier and had to obey orders. But separating public and private matters, the captain had to stand on the opposite side and discuss the issue with Charles. However, now the captain realized that Charles wasn't what he thought. Charles was one of their own. Charles raised his glass to the captain and said, Not just for Christmas, Captain. From now on you can agree on a breakfast time, hang up a sign, eat breakfast quietly, and then put the sign away and continue with your usual routine. Do you agree? Yes, Colonel, the captain nodded heavily. I think the Germans will agree too. That's good. Charles took out his pocket watch and checked it, then instructed, It's almost dawn. I'll have the infantry and military police hold them off. They'll arrive after dawn, and I hope you're prepared before then. Is that all right? No problem, Colonel. The tunnel wasn't high enough, so the captain could only stand upright and salute, but it was still perfectly standard. All right, I've achieved my purpose, Charles said. I should go back now. Merry Christmas, Colonel. The captain's voice choked with emotion. He really didn't ask for anything, he just came to save us. No one would care about the lives of soldiers on the front lines like Charles. Colonel, the captain called out to Charles, who was about to emerge from the tunnel. What? Charles turned around. My name is Claude, Colonel, the captain said, stepping forward. My men and I eagerly hope that one day we can fight under your command. Charles nodded, turned, and crawled out of the tunnel. Chapter 238 Army aircraft confiscated? Less than half an hour after Charles left the front lines, they miraculously returned to a state of combat readiness, the entire defensive line in the state. Joffre remained uneasy and ordered the infantry and military police to proceed to the front lines for inspection as planned. However, the military police captain's report was, They are fighting very seriously, General. We confirm that, and the fighting is fierce. There are gunfire everywhere. Joffre was stunned. This was somewhat illogical. Then the military police inquired again, General, should we still implement the execution order? Joffre fell silent upon receiving the telegram, seemingly undecided. Keynes, standing beside him, advised, General, they have chosen to obey orders. If obeying orders and disobeying orders result in the same outcome, both facing execution orders, then the execution order loses its deterrent effect. Joffre thought this made sense. When the troops had already chosen to obey orders, implementing an execution order would not only be ineffective but could also be counterproductive. Thinking of this, Joffre nodded and said, Dismiss the leading officer and investigate him. Make him a soldier with a rifle. His idea was that with such a high casualty rate on the battlefield, demoting these officers with a tendency to disobey orders to soldiers would soon result in them becoming wounded or appearing on the death list, which would be equivalent to dealing with them. Yes, General, Keynes responded, secretly relieved. When Charles returned to headquarters, it was already past 10 o'clock. Galleri didn't ask any questions. He seemed to have guessed what method Charles had used, but he didn't expose him. He simply told Charles to eat something and go to his dormitory to rest, and that he would send someone to call Charles if needed. This suited Charles perfectly. After a whole night of commotion, although he had slept on the train, he still felt tired. However, things just didn't go as planned. Charles was stopped by Lieutenant Colonel Fernand as soon as he returned from the officer mess. Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand handed Charles a telegram. German machine gun planes have appeared. They've shut down 3 of our reconnaissance aircraft. Charles was startled and asked, What type? The exact type is uncertain, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand replied, but it's clearly a 2-seater. Charles grunted in agreement. At this time, only 2-seater aircraft had enough payload to carry machine guns. Otherwise, just 2 machine guns would overwhelm a single-seater or disrupt its balance. This meant his estimate was correct. and the Germans hadn't had time to produce dedicated fighter planes. Fernandon continued, "We estimate that the Germans are trying to use machine gun planes to restore the fighting order between the two armies." Charles paused, then understood. With a ceasefire at the front, Germany was just as anxious as France. Their solution was to use aircraft to break the ceasefire agreement. Dive-bombing French lines and firing indiscriminately would create enough chaos. The French soldiers, suffering losses, would think the Germans had broken the agreement and would naturally return fire. The German soldiers were unable to defend themselves. Although they hadn't done it, it was the German planes that had, leaving them no choice but to retaliate. Soon, the fighting would spread across the entire front, rendering the ceasefire meaningless. What the Germans didn't expect was that before they could even make an impact, fighting had resumed on the front lines. With nothing else to do, the German pilots could only vent their frustration on the French reconnaissance planes, leading to the downing of 3. Otherwise, the German machine gun planes might have remained dormant for some time. As Charles entered the command post, Gallieni waved to him. As Charles approached, Gallieni pointed to the map on the office wall and said, "We plan to set up several additional airfields at the front and send pilots there. Do you think these locations are suitable?" Charles glanced at the map and gave a negative answer. "At least 50 kilometers from the front." Gallieni looked puzzled. 50 kilometers means it would take half an hour for planes to reach the front, Colonel. I think the airfield should be as close to the front as possible so our planes can be deployed to the battlefield faster and more promptly. So, the airfields are only 10 kilometers from the front, Charles countered. What's the problem? Gallieni looked at Charles, puzzled. That's already beyond enemy fire range. This wasn't Gallieni's fault. He was unaware of the future of air combat, nor its development. He had even become accustomed to France's absolute air superiority. "General," Charles pointed to the enemy's direction on the map and said, "We should consider this. The enemy also has aircraft, and we can't maintain air superiority forever. If we set up our airfields 10 kilometers from the front lines, the Germans will easily spot them, and then their planes will attack our airfields." Gallieni said "Oh," and nodded slightly. 10 kilometers. When frontline soldiers see German aircraft formations, they won't even know if the targets are artillery, infantry, or the airfield, so they can't provide early warning to the airfields. Even if they do provide early warning, the pilots will only have about 10 minutes to take off. That's too short a time for them to prepare. Charles's 50 kilometers would avoid these problems. The airfields would be separated from the frontline troops, and if enemy aircraft fly over frontline targets without making a move, it means their target is the rear airfields. At the same time, 50 kilometers provides half an hour of preparation time, enough for airfield fighters to take off and form up. Thinking it over, Gallieni nodded in agreement to the plan. "Do as you say, Colonel. Move all the airfields to the rear. The airfields that have already been built must also be moved to the rear," Charles emphasized. "Otherwise, we won't be able to provide cover for those airfields." After a pause, Charles added, "It would be best to integrate all the aircraft into the Air Force for unified command." Charles was referring to the aircraft in the Army's hands. At this time, the French Army's aircraft organization was very chaotic. Some were under the Corps organization, some were under the Division organization, some had them, some didn't, and the types of aircraft were varied, with each using their own tactics. Gallieni expressed his confusion. If all the Army's aircraft are integrated into the Air Force, how will the Army solve its need for aircraft? Charles did not hesitate at all. Contact the flight squadrons, and have them dispatch aircraft to complete the designated missions. Gallieni considered the map for a while. Seemingly understanding the benefits of doing so, it would reduce the command pressure on various units, reduce the possibility of chaos, and maximize the utilization of resources such as aircraft, airfields, pilots, and ground crew. However, Gallieni laughed, "You might be right to do this, but do you know what Joffre will think?" Charles nodded. Joffre would think Charles was weakening his power. After all, this meant confiscating all the Army's aircraft, airfields, and pilots and handing them over to Charles. Chapter 239A Theme. Military organization typically follows this principle. In areas with poor communication equipment and insufficient command capabilities, branches of service should be separated as much as possible to reduce command pressure and avoid chaos. Conversely, in areas with good communication equipment and high command levels, branches can be integrated and commanded uniformly. The latter is the concept of a combined arms battalion, where a modern battalion incorporates infantry, artillery, armored units, and even air force. allowing for close coordination and the formation of a powerful combat force. However, this can only be achieved with modern communication equipment and a high level of command, otherwise, it will not only fail to form combat power but also descend into chaos. The most typical example is the Soviet Union in the early stages of World War II, where they dispersed tanks, artillery, and aircraft among the infantry. This approach was conceptually advanced and the idea was appealing. Any division could have tanks, artillery, and even air force, everything, leading to strong combat power. But the reality was, they were in complete chaos under the German offensive. Each branch didn't know what to do or how to do it, fighting haphazardly like headless flies, ultimately being defeated piecemeal or even encircled and annihilated by the Germans. Charles's decision to integrate and unify the command of army aircraft stemmed from this consideration. During World War I, communication equipment was extremely primitive, radios were not widespread, and even telephones were unreliable. Forcing infantry and air force together would be a nightmare for the Air Force. They should operate independently, developing unified tactics under unified training and coordinated systematically with other branches of the armed forces under unified command. Only then could they be effective on the battlefield. But then, problems arose. Gallieri, sitting helplessly in his chair, replied, "It's no use convincing me, Colonel. You should convince the Commander-in-Chief of France. I can only command 2 armies, and beyond that, I only have advisory authority. I can submit your idea to General Staff as a suggestion, but don't even think about it, you know what the result will be." "Yes, General," Charles replied. Needless to say, Joffre would never cooperate with Charles in easily handing over command of his troops. Seeing Gallieni's nonchalant expression, Charles felt a surge of anger. "General, if we can't integrate the army's aircraft in time, they might be picked off one by the Germans." Gallieni shrugged. "You're the flight squadron commander, Colonel, and you're the one who came up with this idea. As for me, I'm not sure which one is right." Lieutenant Colonel Fernand, who had been listening nearby, interjected, "If we can't get the Commander-in-Chief's approval directly, could we go through Parliament?" Gallieni shook his head, rejecting the plan. Although Charles had made some progress through his efforts, it was still far from enough to unite Schneider and the entire right wing. The 2 right-wing factions alone held over 200 of the 500 seats. They might not be able to contend with the left wing, but if they allied with any left-wing group, they could gain a majority. Charles knew this, so he wasn't considering Parliament, at least not for now. So, perhaps the only one who could make a difference was. Charles turned his gaze to Cobdo, who was engrossed in writing something at his desk. Gallieri and Fernand understood, their gazes simultaneously turning to Cobdo. Cobdo was currently agonizing over the Christmas truce, a potentially excellent news story. He had already written numerous articles and even roughly arranged them. However, the Commander-in-Chief issued a media control order. All media outlets were forbidden from reporting on the truce, under penalty of endangering national security. Note, the media censorship of the Christmas truce wasn't limited to France. British and American media were also blocked until 6 days later when the New York Times broke through the blockade to report on it, followed by British coverage. So, what should they report on during this time? Christmas food and merriment? These seemed absent at the front, and would only further demoralize the already collapsing soldiers. Heroic fighting? They were already weary of war. This seemed inappropriate. Perhaps this could help popularize some knowledge about the 37mm mortar. At this moment, Cobdo felt the gazes of others. He turned to Charles and the others, asking in confusion, "What happened?" "A topic, Cobdo." Charles's expression was slightly mysterious. "You'll be busy." "Very good," Cobdo thought to himself. He needed a topic. Snow-covered landscape. The airfield of the 9th Corps of the 2nd Army of France was located in the town of Morphy, 7 kilometers away from the front line. This airfield was very rudimentary, with only 1 runway and 7 aircraft, all of them old Gaudrons and Pigeons. They were haphazardly parked in the corners of the airfield, their roofs made of a few pieces of canvas pieced together, supported by wooden strips to keep out the snow. There was no wall around the airfield, only a few fences and barbed wire to create a cordon, with a sign that read "Military Area, No Trespassing." When Cobdo arrived with 2 reporters, he snapped photos of the airport facilities. He then asked Major Langev, the airport's manager, with a sigh, "Has your airport always been like this?" Major Langev, a man in his 50s with a weary expression, replied, "No, not like that, sir. What you see now is the result of our hard work. It should be in its best condition now, In its best condition now? Kobdo asked in surprise. Major Langev nodded. Of course. This used to be a muddy mess, full of bomb craters, and even had bodies to clear. See that runway? We built that ourselves with entrenching tools. Now we have to shovel snow every day, otherwise we can't carry out any missions. Kobdo quickly directed the reporters to take some close-up photos of the runway. It already had obvious potholes, clearly a hazard for aircraft takeoff. Kobdo cast a sympathetic glance at Major Langev. Is it similar for other units? I mean, other air units, of course. Major Langev nodded firmly. Most of our troops are fighting on the front lines, and manpower is extremely scarce everywhere. Naturally, no one is helping us build airfields. So, yes, other air units are in a similar situation. We're considered lucky. Then Major Langev added, except for the Flying Club in Paris. Really? Kobdo seized the opportunity to ask, why is the Flying Club in Paris an exception? Is that even a question? Major Langev chuckled. That's Charles's unit. Charles is different. He's willing to spend money on his flying squadrons. Their pilots receive at least 60 francs a month in allowances, which is 3 times ours. Thank you for the 15-figure donation. Chapter 240 Utilize the Germans. Is it just a matter of allowances? Kobdo prompted the major to continue. No, of course not. Major Langev waved to the planes behind him. Look at our planes. They're all reconnaissance planes, not a single machine gunner. Several pilots couldn't help but gather around, complaining all at once. Even the reconnaissance planes are old planes that have been flying for over a year. They keep breaking down. I lack the spare parts. I can't fix them. And the infantry only care about one thing. They need to know something, so they send us up in the air to take a look. They always think it's easy. The more they talked, the more aggrieved they became, soon turning it into an accusation, wishing they could bring those infantrymen here to experience it for themselves. Kobdo added fuel to the fire. I heard that one of the planes recently shot down by the enemy came from your airfield. The pilot's anger was immediately ignited. Yes, the pilot was Adrian, a great young man, and also our best mechanic. We don't know what the future holds. The Germans already have machine gun planes, while we only have pistols. The infantry always say we're not in danger, but that's not true. I don't understand. We invented machine gun planes first, so why are we the ones getting attacked and fearing? Where are our machine gun planes? Kobdo explained, that's probably because you're in 2 different command systems. Although we have machine gun planes, they don't even know you're in danger. Yes, Major Langev nodded in agreement, his tone tinged with helplessness. Although we fly in the sky, our organization, allowances, and command all belong to the army. Charles's flying squadron, that's the real aircraft unit. We can't get reinforcements with machine gun planes unless we have our own. The other pilots chimed in with their own comments, but that's impossible. Every army has its own reconnaissance planes and its own airfields, and the infantry divisions, they also have their own planes. There are at least 20 such makeshift airfields along the front lines. If we were to equip each airfield with enough machine gun planes, we'd need at least several hundred. Kobdo ended the interview. He didn't say much about Charles, only mentioning the flying club at most. Kobdo understood that if you were to ask the pilots too bluntly, if you were to merge with Charles's flight squadron and be placed under Charles's command, the pilots might be very willing, but everyone would think, the Meritorious Service Gazette belongs to Charles, and Kobdo is a reporter for the Meritorious Service Gazette. Therefore, Kobdo's interview would actually be helping Charles acquire these airfields, a sinister intention. This would not only be ineffective but would also give the capitalists leverage against him. Therefore, Kobdo carefully controlled the scope of the interview. However, at the end of each interview, he would always leave the pilots with a question: how do you hope to improve the current situation, and what is the future development direction of Army aircraft? Similar interviews weren't limited to just one airfield. Except for a few airfields that Chaffee considered top secret and thus denied permission, reporters from the Honors Daily visited almost every makeshift Army airfield and reported on their current condition in the newspaper. This led to a question: was there any need for these numerous, dilapidated, and virtually unmanaged airfields to exist? Discussions quickly spread among the military and civilians. This is tantamount to suicide. They're like small workshops on the street. Imagine these pilots being nothing more than sitting ducks when facing German machine gunners. They'll be useless and become excellent practice targets for the Germans. They'll be picked off one by the Germans. They have no chance of survival. Driven by this hot topic, Other newspapers followed suit, and the discussion gradually shifted to the issue of future development. We should integrate them into a unified management system. The most suitable person to command them is clearly Charles. He manages the first air group very well. Yes, the first air group always achieves victory under his command. He invented the machine gunner, and he understands aerial combat. Galleri nodded in satisfaction. His desk was piled high with various newspapers, including Le Petit Journal, Le Petit Paris, Le Monde, and even Le Figaro, a newspaper intended for the nobility. Well done, Cobdo. Galleri took a sip of coffee, praising Cobdo as he flipped through the newspaper. Public opinion is moving in our favor. Yes, General. Cobdo glanced at Charles and replied, we don't need to rush. Charles's achievements speak for themselves, everyone can see them. Letting the citizens themselves demand Charles' command will be far more effective than Charles asking. Galleri nodded in agreement. At this point, the meritorious service daily retreated to the sidelines and focused on other hot topics, a very clever tactic. Cobdo knew how to guide public opinion. And then what? Are we just going to wait? Lieutenant Colonel Fernand asked anxiously. The German machine gun planes might already be ready somewhere, ready to launch a deadly attack on the Army's aircraft at any moment. They will retaliate, Cobdo replied abruptly. Who? The Germans, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand asked doubtfully. No, Lieutenant Colonel, Cobdo lowered his voice. Currently, our opponent is not the Germans. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand was taken aback, then realized that Cobdo was referring to Joffre. Galleri hummed in agreement. Of course he won't sit idly by, he'll try to steer public opinion in another direction. Charles already understood Cobdo's entire plan. This guy's strategy in the information war was no less sophisticated than Charles's. Sure enough, Cobdo replied, yes, I suspect that to maintain command of these airfields, Joffre will equip them with machine gunners and increase manpower and resources, and then, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand frowned, he didn't think this was good news. Galleri and Charles didn't speak, only exchanging a meaningful glance. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand suddenly understood, the battle would ultimately be a battle. Joffre's deployment would force him to face direct attacks from German aircraft. He would demonstrate through one or even several defeats that this decision was foolish and wrong. Cobdo was using the Germans to defeat Joffre. Ultimately, Joffre would be forced to compromise. Chapter 241 Cobdo's Trap. The town of Huysmans, 30 kilometers southeast of Paris, was strategically located roughly in the center of the defensive line. This unique geographical position allowed for rapid communication with both the northern and southern French defenses, and its convenient location made it easy to defend and difficult to attack, thus making it the chosen location for the French general headquarters. The headquarters was housed in a villa with a garden in the town, equipped with ample food, clean rooms, and a full range of amenities, including a swimming pool, though unfortunately unusable in the winter. Joffre believed that only such an environment could allow him and the headquarters to operate methodically. Joffre had always maintained a habit of reading the newspaper, but he hadn't touched it for the past few days. The newspapers were filled with news he didn't want to see. The army doesn't need planes. These missions can be completely handed over to the air squadrons. Even if the army needed them, they couldn't guarantee the safety of these reconnaissance planes. The army's planes are just adding to the Germans' gains. Absurd. Joffre scoffed at these discussions. These bastards, they don't know what war is. War is about using limited resources to maximize combat effectiveness. Can't they see that our army's planes persisted in fighting and functioning under such harsh conditions? That in itself is a victory. Joffre was adept at sophistry. 4 months after the victory at the Battle of the Marne, people debated whether Galleri or Joffre was the hero who saved Paris. Joffre seemed to have only done one thing, persuaded a British expeditionary force to join the battle. Everything else, including commanding the troops, was Galleri's doing. But then Joffre said, I don't really know, but I know who will be responsible if it's a defeat. This meant that if the battle were lost, Joffre, as commander-in-chief of France, would be held responsible. Therefore, since the battle was won, the credit should naturally go to Joffre. Thus, using this bizarre logic, he conveniently seized Galleri's credit. Similarly, he readily attributed the chaos, rudimentary technology, and disorganization of the army's aircraft to hardship, perseverance, and greatness. If Joffre were smart enough, he should have chosen to relinquish control at this point. But he was never a smart man. He even had a nickname, the slow-witted general. Carnes saw the danger and cautiously advised, General, if it were before, we might have continued like this without a problem, because we had absolute air superiority, but now, the Germans have machine gun planes, while the army still only has reconnaissance planes. The Germans could easily shoot down all our reconnaissance planes, Joffre answered without hesitation. Then why can't we equip these reconnaissance planes with machine guns? They should fight the Germans. Carnes paused, having commanded Charles's air squadron during the Cape Town campaign, and knew something about machine gun planes. Yes, General, Carnes replied. Then, leaning closer, he whispered, some reconnaissance planes aren't suitable for machine guns, they're too heavy for them. He couldn't let the other staff officers hear this, otherwise, the commander-in-chief would appear to them as a fool who knew nothing about airplanes or air combat but was spouting nonsense. Then Keynes added, currently, only two-seater aircraft are suitable for conversion into machine gun aircraft, and many of our reconnaissance aircraft are outdated. Chaffee, without changing his expression, grunted, then order a batch of aircraft to protect the reconnaissance planes. Yes, General, Keynes responded, but didn't leave. Chaffee turned and looked at Keynes with a puzzled expression. General, Keynes replied, the most suitable aircraft at present might be the Avro, but that model is produced by the Charles factory. Chaffee interrupted Keynes decisively, use other models. You're in charge of this. Yes, General, Keynes left with a sense of helplessness. The formation of the aircraft force couldn't avoid the Charles. Even if they didn't use the Avro, they would still need the machine gun firing coordinator. However, Keynes knew it was best not to report this to Chaffee and to handle it through government procurement. At this moment, Joffre wasn't thinking about how to organize, train, or fight the enemy. He felt he had inadvertently opened up a new avenue of thought. Everyone assumed the Army's aircraft would be brought under Charles's unified command, so why couldn't each Army unit develop its own independent flight squadrons? If all 7 armies had, no, the 2 armies under Gallieri's command should be weakened, and his 5 armies should each develop a powerful flight squadron. Then, what would Charles's flight squadrons amount to? Thinking this, Joffre felt it necessary to discuss this with James and have him carry it out. Soon, 2 arguments emerged. One supported bringing the Army's aircraft under Charles's unified command, the other argued that the Army should have its own flight squadrons, allowing for better and faster responses, and making the Army stronger. Joffre represented the latter. He urgently placed an order for 202-seater Gaudrons and 102-seater Newport 10s, and began recruiting pilots to form the squadrons. Gallieri merely smiled when he saw the intelligence. Joffre was walking step by step into the trap of Cobdo. The commander-in-chief of France, actually fooled by a journalist. Wasn't that ironic? Gallieri waved the telegram at Charles, who sat a few meters away. Are these 2 aircraft types useful to you? Charles knew what the aircraft types were and understood Gallieri's meaning. Judging by how things were developing, these planes would eventually fall into Charles's hands. Everything Joffre had done was benefiting Charles, only he didn't know it yet. Gallieri asked this because he worried that these planes would be bought but not used, a huge waste for the military. Any aircraft is useful, Charles replied. If all else fails, they can be used as training aircraft for pilots. We desperately need that. What Charles valued more were the pilots Joffre would train for him. However, of course, he couldn't seem to have any hope for the pilots trained by Joffre. All right, Gallieni nodded calmly. Let him buy it. The rest is up to the Germans. In the past, Gallieni might have tried his best to prevent this from happening, as it would inevitably result in the loss of innocent pilots. Now he seemed to understand that these sacrifices were unavoidable, and the sooner they occurred, the fewer the sacrifices. The image above shows the 2-seat Gaudron reconnaissance aircraft, first flight in 1913. The image above shows the 2-seat Newport reconnaissance aircraft, first flight in late 1914. Chapter 242 Charles's Class. Charles was unconcerned about Cobdo's trap. At most, Charles would cooperate with Cobdo in interviews to further boost his popularity and approval ratings in the meritorious service newspaper. However, these interviews had nothing to do with the airport or the acquisition of Army aircraft. Instead, they shifted the focus to frontline supplies. For example, Charles would continue to donate marching blankets and socks to the front lines, along with food, cigarettes, and other supplies. Cobdo even hinted in several articles that Charles had no interest in acquiring Army aircraft, believing that quality was more important than quantity. He possessed one of the world's most elite air forces, and adding a rabble would only increase his troubles. Cobdo understood human nature. He knew that asking for help and being asked for help were completely different, even though both involved acquiring Army aircraft. If Charles adopted a begging attitude, offering various generous conditions to entice army pilots to join, the pilots would become wary. Is Charles so eager for us to join because he has ulterior motives? Is it dangerous? But if Charles adopted a cold and aloof approach, the pilots would become anxious. Look, Charles doesn't want us. It must be because we haven't met his requirements or are facing some difficulties. We should try harder to get in. As a result, they flocked to him like a swarm of locusts. During this period, Charles focused his attention on aerial bombs and the Caproni bomber. He believed that using fighter planes to chase and shoot down the Germans one by one was too inefficient. Bombers could directly take out enemy planes along with their pilots, even reserve pilots, without lifting a finger. That would be much more satisfying. The development of aerial bombs was rapid. After all, the St. Etienne Armory was responsible for this, possessing experience, a foundation, and talented personnel. It was developed in just 1 week, and its performance was very stable after testing. The Caproni bomber took a little longer to develop. Eric and the research department produced 3 prototypes in 2.5 weeks. They had initially thought it would require at least several weeks of test flights to refine its design before mass production. However, the success of the test flights exceeded everyone's expectations. Its performance was outstanding. Even carrying an 800-kilogram load, it could still reach a speed of 113 kilometers per hour. This delighted Eric, who excitedly reported to Charles on the phone, "This is simply a miracle, Colonel. We even doubted whether it was a tested or even improved model. Unbelievable, the prototype could be so perfect, 113 kilometers per hour. Do you know what that means? It could become the safest dedicated bomber in the world." Charles understood what Eric meant. At present, most fighter jets, such as the Avro, had a speed of only around 100 kilometers per hour, and the German fighter jets were no exception. But the Caproni bomber, equipped with 3 engines, could reach a speed of 113 kilometers per hour even when carrying a heavy load. All the fighters, both friendly and enemy, couldn't keep up with the Caproni, so they couldn't possibly catch it and shoot it down. This meant it didn't need fighter escorts. It could go solo, bombing enemy lines and escaping unscathed. Charles calmly instructed Eric on a few things. "I want the R&D department to continue increasing engine horsepower, also, mass-produce bombers, aiming for 20 within 2 weeks. Meanwhile, the development of single-seat fighters can also be put on the agenda." Eric excitedly replied, "Yes, Colonel." Then he couldn't help but exclaim, "We might create a miracle in aviation history." Charles didn't want to create any aviation miracles. He only wanted the bombers to maintain their speed advantage. One day, when the Germans increased engine horsepower so that fighters could catch up with the 100-horsepower Caproni, Charles developed a 150-horsepower engine. Thus, the bomber's speed would once again surpass that of German fighters, and German airfields would still be groaning under the bomber's wings. This would simplify air combat, as German pilots would have to constantly be on edge, fearing bombing while fighting. The snow stopped that day, and the sunlight shone brightly on the snow, almost blindingly so. Charles took some time to visit the Carter Flying Club, wanting to know how the pilots of the first group were training. When the car arrived at the airport, Carter was gesturing wildly as he lectured his students in a classroom on the first floor. The students seemed to be new pilots. They lacked the weariness and desolation of Carter's previous group, displaying more innocence and passion. However, Carter's lecturing skills seemed lacking. The classroom was lifeless and somewhat oppressive. Carter himself looked distressed, scratching his head anxiously, as if he and his students were performing a mutual torture exercise. Carter saw Charles enter from afar, nodded to the students, and asked, "Haven't you all been wanting to see Colonel Charles?" The students perked up, sitting up straight. Carter smiled and waved to Charles towards the door. The students gasped in unison. Could this young colonel be Charles? Carter stepped forward and shook hands with Charles, saying with a helpless expression, "Say a few words, Colonel. Many of them joined our flight squadron just to see you. They don't want to listen to the lectures at all." The classroom fell silent for a few seconds. The students finally confirmed that the person before them was indeed Charles, and then enthusiastic applause erupted. Charles walked gracefully to the podium, his tone calm. "Hello, gentlemen. If you joined the flight squadron because you wanted to see me, then you may be disappointed. You've probably seen me more often on the streets of Paris than here." The students smiled knowingly. Many had indeed made this mistake. They assumed that because Charles was the flight squadron leader, they could become his subordinates. But the truth was, Charles rarely visited the flying club. Perhaps only once a month. After the laughter subsided, Charles asked a question. Do you know the difference between a flight squadron and other branches of the military? The cadets were silent for a moment, then answered one after another. Flying squadrons fight the enemy in the sky, Colonel. We're faster. We have more women who like us. The cadets burst into laughter, and Carter glared at them. The cadets quickly stopped laughing, but still maintained their smiles. This was the nature of pilots. They should be unrestrained and have their own personalities. If they were always too conventional, it would be difficult to become excellent pilots. Charles didn't get angry. He gave his answer, word by word. I think the biggest difference is that you are all alone, gentlemen. On the battlefield, you can only rely on yourselves. No one can help you. The cadets' expressions became serious, and some even nodded silently. They knew what Charles meant. Air combat at that time lacked basic communication equipment, making coordination between aircraft extremely difficult. They were essentially on their own, either tailing the enemy or being tailed themselves. Aircraft malfunctioned, leaked fuel, or were even hit in plummeting. Everything depended on them, until the very last step. Sometimes, even with comrades nearby, they couldn't help and could only watch helplessly as it all happened. Chapter 243. A mailman turn. I'm traveling these past few days, so updates will be limited to 2 per day for now. I'll resume 3 updates per day when I get back. I apologize for that. Pilots are lonely. The moment they climb into the cockpit and take to the skies, their fate seems to be linked to the aircraft but separated from everyone else. Charles warned the trainees in a low voice, you should get used to all of this, gentlemen. Learn to rely on yourselves, acquire the necessary knowledge, or train your independent combat capabilities. Only in this way can you survive on the battlefield and ultimately become qualified pilots. The classroom was quiet for a moment, then erupted in enthusiastic applause again. After leaving the classroom, Carter led Charles to his office. The office could also be considered Carter's command center. It was still as messy as ever, even the chair handed to Charles had just been cleared from the clutter. Carter sat down opposite Charles, flipping through documents as he reported, we currently have about 300 veteran pilots, over 100 new trainees, and over 300 fighter jets. If this continues, our club will need to expand. It can't hold so many people and aircraft. Charles nodded without speaking. Expand? Carter was overthinking it. The reason was that there hadn't been any air combat recently, was that pilots hadn't suffered any losses. Once the fighting started, both aircraft and pilots would be injured or killed in the battle, and the new recruits would be lucky to fill the gaps. Carter seemed to realize this too, and he asked with some concern, is the air combat about to begin? He had gleaned some information from recent newspapers. The flight squadron was showing signs of incorporating Army aircraft, which was preparation for air combat. Charles didn't answer, but instead asked, are you ready? Carter straightened up and answered confidently, yes, Colonel, we're ready. We've been practicing the 8 rules of air combat. If the Germans don't have this experience, we believe they're no match for us. Charles hummed in agreement. That might be true at first, but as long as you apply the tactics on the battlefield, Carter agreed, the Germans will soon know these tactics, and next time, they'll use them against us. Yes, Charles said, so you must keep improving. Understood, Colonel, Carter replied. Carter got up to make coffee for Charles, shaking his head as he worked, as if discussing something absurd. Many people ask me what to do if the enemy bites their tail during practice. I tell them they should ask God or pray to him. Charles didn't answer. He suddenly thought of a tactic that could solve the problem of being bitten on the tail in this era, which might further enhance the squadron's combat effectiveness. Carter handed Charles the coffee, saying, you're not thinking about how to solve this problem, are you? Carter chuckled. To him, it seemed ridiculous. They might bite the enemy's tail, and the enemy might bite theirs. Thinking about solutions was as foolish as trying to dodge enemy bullets. It was impossible. No one is immune to death on the battlefield. No matter how much we train, we can't avoid it. Carter took a sip of his coffee. Seeing that Charles remained silent, Carter's expression slowly changed. He looked at Charles with a mixture of doubt and hope, his tone tinged with anticipation. You don't actually have a solution, do you? I can only say there's a possibility of evasion, Charles replied calmly. But practice is still required. God, Carter jumped up, spilling his coffee all over the table. He quickly grabbed a piece of clothing and wiped himself clean, then frantically pulled out paper and a pen from a drawer. No need to write this down, Captain. Charles glanced at the side and picked up two model airplanes from the table. These were common in flying clubs, probably Carter's former side job. The flying clubs used to be like tourist attractions, accepting visitors and selling souvenirs. We'll demonstrate, and you'll understand. Charles held one model in each hand, aligning them to mimic a tail-biting maneuver, explaining while simulating a flight path. If the pilot biting from behind is skilled enough, no matter how we evade, they'll always follow our movements, and even feints will make it difficult to shake them off. Yes, Carter nodded. Then, a hint of doubt flickered in his eyes. This assumption was already a dead end. The fighters behind only needed to pull the trigger and fire, making it almost impossible for the aircraft in front to escape. "We can try to pull up, Captain," Charles said. "No, Colonel," Carter flatly rejected the plan. "Pulling up will only hasten our demise. The enemy will choose to fire at the moment of pull-up." Carter's eyes showed disappointment. He believed Charles had made a mistake this time. His recent tail-chasing training had taught him one thing: when being tailed by an enemy aircraft, pulling up is the worst thing you can do. To the left, to the right, or down, the speed is fast, and they all have the potential to escape the enemy's pursuit. Only pulling up, due to the weight of the aircraft, is very slow and exposes a large area of the fuselage to the enemy's guns. Doing so is almost suicide. But Charles insisted, calmly demonstrating and explaining, "Of course, we can't pull up directly. Before pulling up, we need to do a dive maneuver, a feint." Carter was somewhat puzzled. He had just assumed the enemy pilot was a skilled pilot, one who wouldn't be fooled by feints. "This isn't a feint, Captain," Charles replied. "This is standard procedure for gaining altitude. After the dive, immediately raise the nose at a sharp angle. You'll find that the plane no longer ascends slowly at a small angle, but climbs at a near vertical angle. Its ascent speed will be much faster than before, and the enemy often won't have time to react." Really? Carter was stunned. He had never tried this maneuver before. "Yes," Charles nodded. "Try it and you'll see. After the climb, the plane will be in an inverted position with its belly facing upwards. Then, do a roll, and it will return to normal." Carter exclaimed in surprise. "At this point, we have altitude advantage. We can turn the tables and catch the enemy's tail with just one dive." Charles nodded slightly. Of course, Charles didn't invent this. He knew nothing about aircraft. It was a maneuver invented by Immelmann, Germany's earliest ace pilot, and it was thus named the Immelmann turn or ascent inverted turn. Even today, this maneuver is frequently used in combat training or aerobatic performances. The image above shows an Immelmann turn. Modern fighter jets no longer need to dive before climbing. Aircraft during World War I, due to their low horsepower and slow speed, needed to dive and then pull back to instantly adjust their attitude to vertical climb. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 244: German Warplanes. Snow continued to fall heavily, and a thin layer of ice formed around the aircraft due to the bitter cold. Major Goldfer, wearing goggles, led a squadron of Newport 10s towards the German lines, braving the biting wind. Looking at the two machine guns in front of the planes, Major Goldfer felt as if he were in a dream. 2 weeks ago, he was performing in Lyon. Now he was the squadron leader of the 3rd Squadron of the 2nd French Flying Group. Goldfer had refused the invitation, telling the lieutenant who approached him, "I have no interest in military service, sir. I prefer a free life. Being bossed around all the time would drive me crazy." He added, "If I wanted to be a soldier, I would have joined Charles's flying squadron long ago." However, the lieutenant handed Goldfer a conscription notice. "You'd better take my advice, sir. Otherwise, you'll become an infantryman." This was Joffre's strategy. If he couldn't recruit these men with flying potential, Charles wouldn't be able to either. Ultimately, Goldfer chose the former, or rather, he had no other choice. After enlisting, he began as a second lieutenant, serving as an instructor in the 3rd Flying Squadron, responsible for teaching those with absolutely no flying experience how to fly. The 3rd Flying Squadron originally had 36 men, but 2 weeks later only 28 remained. Flying an airplane is not like driving a car. Any misoperation during flight would most likely result in a crash and certain death. But this was no big deal for the military. They simply added a casualty to the list. contacted the family to provide a 260 franc compensation payment, and that was the end of it. Goldfried, however, soon rose to the rank of major and began leading the 28 surviving pilots on missions. Goldford even argued with Colonel Eiger about this. They've only just learned some basic operations, some of them might even crash and die during landing, and now we're asking them to fly missions? It's too dangerous, we don't have time, Major. Colonel Eiger's tone left no room for argument. Look at the battlefield. Yesterday we lost 5 more reconnaissance planes to the Germans, and we can't do anything about it. What about Charles's planes? Goldford asked. They've defeated the Germans many times, why aren't we sending them? It's simple. Colonel Eiger pointed to the map on the defensive line. Look at this, our defensive line is over 300 kilometers long, with 51 infantry divisions deployed here and more being added, not even counting the troops recruited from Africa. Charles, on the other hand, only has 1 air squadron, so this can only be done by our infantry, understand? Only by ourselves. Lies, shameless lies. Goldford knew why. They were vying with Charles for control of the Air Force. They wanted the Army's air squadron to be formed as soon as possible, hence this extreme approach. However, an order is an order, and Goldford had no choice but to obey. Thus, a total of 29 aircraft, including Major Goldford's, took off from the airfield. Their mission was to patrol the Somme River area, and to shoot down any German aircraft spotted, whether fighters or reconnaissance planes. As far as I know, the Germans usually only have 4 or 8 aircraft, Colonel Eiger instructed. As long as you stay together, you'll be fine. Major Goldford shook his head slightly. This Colonel Eiger thought that aerial warfare was like land warfare, where numbers and bravery could solve problems. At this moment, the squadron leader, Kalenka, gestured to Major Goldford. Major Goldford looked in the direction he indicated and saw several German Dove reconnaissance planes fleeing to his side and rear. Goldford didn't think much of it, waved, and led his squadron to chase after the German reconnaissance planes. These reconnaissance planes would be good practice for his men, Goldford thought, and he could also report some results to Colonel Eiger. However, after following for a while, Goldford realized that something seemed amiss. These Doves should have used their light and agile fuselages to frequently turn, potentially weakening the Nieuport 10's speed advantage, but they didn't. Goldford frowned, muttering to himself, what's preventing them from turning? What's their purpose? Goldford looked around, his expression changing as his gaze swept over the clouds overhead. He realized the reason. He hurriedly waved, trying to order his squadron to abandon the pursuit, but his men, focused only on their prey, had already floored the throttle and didn't notice Goldford's gesture. Goldford shouted, but the cold wind blowing in his face rendered him speechless. Things unfolded exactly as Major Goldford had feared. A dozen German fighters suddenly appeared in the clouds, swooping down amidst the swirling snowflakes, fiercely spitting fire at the Nieuport 10. 3 Nieuport 10s had no chance to react, instantly losing balance and crashing to the ground. 1 even exploded and disintegrated in midair. The Nieuport 10s were thrown into chaos, scattering like flies being chased, without any strategy or pattern, while the German planes pursued them relentlessly. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat, machine gun fire filled the sky. 1 Nieuport 10 after another was riddled with bullets, plummeting to the ground amidst black smoke and deafening noise. Some had their wings and tails severed, tumbling and crashing through the air. Major Goldford was terrified the moment he encountered the enemy. Having never experienced war, he could hardly believe his eyes. Fortunately, when a German plane swooped down, he sensed the danger and jolted awake, quickly swerving to avoid it. At this point, skill and tactics were irrelevant, only instinct mattered. Major Goldford pulled his plane up, knowing that only by maintaining altitude could he possibly escape the enemy's pursuit. Suddenly, 2 Nieuport 10s, simultaneously chasing an enemy aircraft, collided in midair. The scene was horrific. After a burst of fire, shattered aircraft parts filled the sky. Goldford dodged and weaved through the debris, narrowly escaping the smoke, and suddenly spotted a German fighter ahead. He recognized it as a German Albatros B, a civilian test aircraft that hadn't been kept secret before the war. Goldford had seen it once before at an airshow in Germany the previous year, but now it was his opponent. Goldford gritted his teeth, increased the throttle, and pulled the trigger. Bullets rattled, sending splinters flying from the Albatros B. Soon after, its nose tilted, and it plummeted to the ground amidst black smoke. This was Goldford's first enemy aircraft shot down, and the only enemy aircraft shot down by the 3rd Squadron in this battle. The image above shows a German Albatros B-2C reconnaissance aircraft, first flown in 1914, and entered service in 1915. Chapter 245 Bomber Squadron. Major Immelman remained hidden in the clouds, observing the battlefield below with satisfaction. His first squadron was wreaking havoc on the unsuspecting French aircraft. He knew these French planes belonged to the Chaffee organization. Charles's fighters were the Avro, the true enemies to be treated with caution, while these were merely practice targets. However, Major Immelman noticed that one of the planes, despite being ambushed, had launched a counterattack and successfully shot down a German aircraft. Immelman grunted with interest, then slammed his nose down, diving towards the Newport 10. Note, the tactic of using clouds to conceal oneself during a dive attack was invented by Immelman during World War I, but he was ultimately shot down by British aircraft because of this tactic. Soon, Immelman noticed something different about this Newport 10. Its flight maneuvers were extremely agile, erratic, and its feints were almost fooling him. This is an elite pilot, Major Immelman thought. I should try my best to keep him here, otherwise he will become a potential danger. Unbeknownst to Major Immelman, Major Goldford, who was being pursued, was terrified and weak-kneed. He had tried everything but couldn't shake off the tail behind him. Suddenly, the aircraft behind opened fire. Bullets grazed almost to the scalp of Major Goldford, and several bullets hit the fuselage and tail. Splinters of wood even hit his face, stinging painfully. Fortunately, the bullets didn't hit any vital organs, and Major Goldford was still able to control the aircraft. This was based on years of experience. With just the slightest tremor of the wing, he could keenly sense what was wrong and whether he was still under control. At this moment, Major Goldford knew the plane was undamaged and planned to continue his escape. But then he realized the pursuer wouldn't let him go. Continuing like this would only lead to death. Unless the pursuer ran out of ammunition and he survived, which was impossible. Suddenly, a brilliant idea struck Major Goldford. He slightly slowed down, simultaneously maneuvering the plane towards the ground. This was a common trick in Goldford's air shows, designed to elicit gasps from the audience before suddenly pulling back up just as the plane was about to crash. This move earned Major Goldford much applause and thanks. Many people came specifically to witness this thrilling and dangerous spectacle. Major Goldford had used this tactic in desperation. He was also taking a risk, because this required reducing speed, and if the pursuer didn't fall for it and continued its attack, Goldford would be doomed. Fortunately, the tail didn't catch up. Instead, it chased other fighters. Goldford breathed a sigh of relief, and once the tail was far away, he suddenly accelerated, regained his normal posture, and disengaged from the battlefield. Major Immelman, on the other side, also noticed this. Realizing he'd been tricked, he muttered, "Coward. Using this method to evade? What's the difference between this and desertion?" Major Immelman thought this opponent didn't deserve to be a soldier. But Goldford didn't think so much. He only wanted to survive, only hoped to escape this terrible place and never return. Ultimately, only 3 of the 29 fighters returned alive, and all 3 were riddled with bullet holes. One pilot had been shot on the shoulder, bleeding profusely. Even if he survived, he would have to say goodbye to his life as a pilot. Colonel Eiger, however, still naively asked Goldford, "Where are the others? Did they get separated from you?" Once the German Air Force bared its fangs, it relentlessly pursued the French Air Force. They seemed to have a thorough understanding of the French Air Force, launching surprise attacks on 3 French airfields near the front lines in a single day. These airfields, as Charles had described, were too close to the front lines. Most were 10 kilometers away, some only 7 kilometers or even closer. This left them defenseless against the German air raids, and waves of aircraft were destroyed on the airfields or runways before they could even take off. One airfield was even hit, causing its oil depots to burst into flames. The fire raged all night, and many aircraft that couldn't take off perished in the inferno. This also ignited the anger of the French people, who angrily criticized Joffre. "We should entrust the planes to those who know how to command them. This is the consequence of the army owning planes. This practice is a waste of aircraft and pilots' lives. It has been proven that Joffre was wrong. Now, shouldn't Joffre be held responsible for his mistakes?" But at this time, the media controlled by capitalists continued to speak out for Joffre. "Perhaps the Germans have surpassed us in pilot training. They have found an effective way of fighting. There may be another reason for this situation. The performance of the Germans' newly deployed Albatros B fighters is far superior to our fighters. Their performance may also surpass that of the Avro used by Char. The underlying meaning of these remarks was, Joffre did suffer a defeat, but facing the Germans' new fighters and new tactics, Char's first air group might not have been able to win either. Therefore, it was not Joffre's fault. Galleri, seeing these reports in the newspapers, believed the time was ripe. He smiled and nodded at Charles. Ready for what? Charles countered. To engage the first flying group in battle against these German pilots? No, I won't do that. Galleri looked at Charles with suspicion. Wasn't this part of the plan? Charles explained, I have a better way to defeat them, General. They are planes too. The next morning, Charles's Caproni bomber squadron took off from Paris. The squadron consisted of 20 planes, divided into 2 squadrons of 10 each, flying to the German airfields of Hummelsn and Elclay. These airfields had been exposed during the German conflict with Joffre's army aircraft, and the vast majority of German planes and pilots were concentrated there. Hummelsn Airfield also housed the newly opened flight school with over 200 cadets, instructors, and trainees. Charles ordered the bombers to fly openly towards their targets, in broad daylight, without any concealment. He knew the people of that era were unprepared for bombers, viewing them merely as small, manually dropped shells by pilots, shells with low accuracy and weak power, almost incapable of harming their targets. The Germans, seeing 10 Capronis approaching from afar, would assume they were transport planes delivered to their doorstep. What they didn't realize was that the Capronis could indeed be considered a transport plane, but one that delivered bombs to them. Chapter 246. So, what kind of plane was that? At Hummelsn Airport in the German-controlled zone, the sky was gradually brightening at 7 in the morning. Major Immelmann got up on time, quickly washed up, and went out for a jog in his thin military uniform. This was a long-standing habit of Major Immelmann's. He believed that a qualified pilot needed a strong physique, otherwise even the strong winds and low temperatures on the aircraft would be unbearable. Running on the airport road, which had just been cleared of snow, he was surrounded by the shouts of new cadets and the commands of instructors. The cadets at Hummelsn Airport were different from those of the French JAF team. All the cadets here had basic flying skills. Including the more than 100 officially registered pilots, there were a total of 358 pilots, without exception. They only needed simple training and adaptation to the new aircraft to quickly become qualified pilots. This was also the main reason why Immelmann had been able to defeat the French team of 29 aircraft with 13 aircraft yesterday. However, this was also because the opponent was JAF. Major Immelmann thought it would be different if he encountered Charles' pilots. One thing that Major Immelmann couldn't understand was that he had heard Charles knew absolutely nothing about flying. Can someone who doesn't know how to fly a plane build an elite air force? How can he master training subjects and direction? How can he command aircraft in combat? Yet Charles did it, and did it very well. Immelmann, on the other hand, had to combine his own flying experience with repeated discussions with his subordinates, and practice the deduced tactics before applying them on the battlefield. Perhaps this is the difference between talent and hard work. Charles possessed talent, Immelmann possessed hard work. Lacking talent, he could only catch up with Charles by investing more time and energy. What Immelmann didn't know was that he was the talented one. His opponent, Charles, had no talent whatsoever, only knowledge. Half an hour later, Immelmann ran back to his dormitory. The orderly stood at the door to greet him, handing him a towel. Hot milk and freshly baked bread were also prepared in the dormitory. Perhaps it was a sixth sense, but before entering, Immelmann glanced back at the sky, and in that glance, he saw several extremely suspicious small black dots in the air. Immelmann's heart tightened. Years of reconnaissance experience had allowed him to immediately recognize the aircraft type he'd never seen before, even though he couldn't see anything at first. Note, before becoming a fighter pilot, Immelmann was a reconnaissance pilot. He had flown over Paris and dropped leaflets, binoculars. Immelmann ordered his orderly in a low voice. The orderly understood, immediately running back to the barracks and quickly returning, handing Immelmann binoculars. Immelmann raised the binoculars and quickly adjusted the aperture to its widest setting. 10 large aircraft appeared within his field of view. Immelmann frowned. They looked like transport planes, but they couldn't be. Germany didn't have this type of aircraft, and the French wouldn't be transporting supplies to Germany. He put away the binoculars, considered for a moment, and then picked them up again to observe carefully. This time, He observed the underside of the transport planes. He thought he'd seen something there earlier. As the targets drew closer, Immelman finally saw clearly. Rows of dark bombs, densely packed beneath the fuselage. Major Immelman's eyes widened instantly. Good heavens, they had bombs mounted under the planes for dropping. These weren't transport planes, they were bomb-dropping aircraft. Get out of the building, Major Immelman tossed his binoculars to the orderly. Then he turned and sprinted towards the hangar, shouting as he ran, "Take off. Take off immediately. Evacuate the planes, enemy bombs." But Immelman was only a major, a squadron leader. He couldn't give orders to the others. More precisely, the others couldn't understand Major Immelman's warnings, even though some had already spotted the transport planes heading their way, following his instructions. At this time, no one had experienced large-scale bombing raids by professional bombers. They didn't know the danger, and of course, they didn't know how to avoid it. They even stared curiously at these approaching objects, gesturing and speculating, trying to guess what they were. Immelman hesitated for a moment, then rushed into a nearby phone booth, hoping to contact Colonel Klaus so he could give the order. But it was too late. Major Immelman watched helplessly as the planes descended to their lowest altitude, approaching the airport and dropping black bombs. Boom, 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 dot. Explosions rang out, instantly filling the once peaceful airport with flames and smoke. Several planes, about to take off, were destroyed on the runway. Inexperienced cadets scattered in panic, being blown to bits. Immelman realized that most of the bombs had landed in the flight school area. He suddenly understood, the enemy's primary target wasn't the pilots, but the planes. Boom boom, a deafening roar came from the direction of the oil depot, flames shooting hundreds of meters into the sky, the heat shattering the glass of the telephone booths. Major Immelman quickly leaped to the ground. When he looked up again, he saw the airport was a scene of utter devastation, flames everywhere, and littered with corpses and aircraft wreckage. The cadets were brave. They immediately grabbed entrenching tools and joined the firefighting efforts. Major Immelman shouted at them, "Get out of there. Ignore them," but no one listened. Trainees and even pilots rushed forward in droves, not wanting the fire to spread to the hangar, where hundreds of aircraft were neatly parked. Boom. Boom. Another series of explosions followed, a chain reaction of explosions erupting in the hangar, the flames instantly engulfing the pilots and trainees who had rushed to fight the fire. The bombing report only reached the City Defense Command after the bombers returned to the airfield, more than an hour later. Eric excitedly told Charles on the phone, "The bombing was a great success, Colonel. Boats were all on target. Our bombs wrecked the enemy, destroying at least 100 aircraft. Several of their planes tried to catch up with us, but it was completely futile. Our bombers left them far behind, and we even shot down 2 enemy fighters." Shooting down enemy aircraft was possible. The Caproni bomber had a rear-firing machine gun. Before reaching maximum speed, or by intentionally slowing down to allow unsuspecting enemy aircraft to catch up, a sudden burst of bullets could shoot down an enemy plane. Of course, this was only possible if the enemy aircraft were unaware that this large bomber was equipped with machine guns, especially rear-firing ones. After that, German pilots would notice this, and they only needed to approach the Caproni bomber from below, as the Caproni's rear-firing machine gun would be blocked by the angle of fire and unable to engage them. A cheer erupted in the headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand hugged Charles tightly, exclaiming, "You kept it from us, you bastard." Though his words were harsh, his expression held no blame, as it was common knowledge that the headquarters' secrecy was questionable. Keeping it from them was to be expected. Galeri nodded slightly and asked, "So, what kind of plane is it?" "A bomber plane," Charles replied calmly. "Each one can carry 19 bombs, each weighing approximately 40 kilograms, for a total weight of 760 kilograms. As he said this, Charles subtly raised his chin, implying, "If you don't order soon, it'll be in high demand again." Thank you to Poisonous Milk and Book Friend 201811051629041143 for the donations. Chapter 247 Foolish People. The exact results of the bombing cannot be determined. This is because bomber pilots only dropped the bombs and could only glimpse the bombed area from a distance in the sky, making it impossible to know exactly how many planes were destroyed or how many enemy pilots were killed. But there is no doubt that France has regained control of the skies above the defensive line. The previously formidable German Luftwaffe suddenly disappeared, replaced by the Avro of the 1st Char Flying Group. People assumed that the first Char flying group's deployment had scared away the German Luftwaffe. On the surface, this seemed to be the case. All they knew was that during this period, Joffre's army aviation was suffering terribly at the hands of the German Luftwaffe, with planes and airfields being shot down or attacked almost daily, frightening Joffre into moving and hiding his aircraft. Joffre's method was to tow the planes outside the airfields and cover them with tarpaulins, so that attacking German planes could neither spot them nor destroy them. While this was safe, it obviously couldn't train new personnel. Both pilots and trainees were confined to the ground. Then the first Char flying group appeared, and the German Luftwaffe vanished. People speculated that it was Char's first flying group that had driven the Luftwaffe away. The next day, the newspaper Honest Presse published a photograph taken from a distance, with an ambiguous report. Char's newly developed aircraft had performed a great service, destroying 2 German airfields with 16,000 kilograms of bombs. Only then did people realize that the battle had already begun without their knowledge, and that they had won. Public opinion erupted again. People spontaneously organized themselves outside the House of Representatives, chanting, "Support incorporating army aircraft and putting Chaffee under unified command. Spare those poor pilots. Their fate in Chaffee's hands is only to flee or die. We should let those who understand air combat command aircraft, not those laymen who have spent their entire lives dealing with the army." Many army pilots even exposed the chaos at army airfields, complaining fearfully to reporters, "All we do every day is evade. We're not pilots at all. Many people still can't fly, let alone shoot down enemy planes. The planes are a waste in our hands. We don't understand why this is happening." The ball was in Chaffee's court. At headquarters, Chaffee stood by the window, staring blankly at the sky, where several Avro fighters swept across the swirling snowflakes. Carnes stood by, speechless. If Carnes were in this situation, he would have chosen to relinquish control without hesitation. The situation was clear. Chaffee had lost this battle for aircraft, and lost badly. Every decision he made seemed wrong, from the establishment of airfields to the purchase of aircraft and the pilot training program. All were utterly inept. They all bore the distinct style and offensive spirit of the army, but air combat was clearly different from land warfare. If they didn't concede now, they would only have to wait for Parliament to make a decision and then enforce it, at which point they would not only lose the aircraft but also lose face. But Joffre was never one to give up easily. He considered for a moment, then slowly said, his tone full of complaint, "Foolish people, they can't tell the difference between the two. Charles used bombers, not his first flying group, to defeat the Germans. If we had such bombers, we could achieve victory as well." Carnes's eyes widened. What Joffre said seemed to be true. Such bombers could achieve victory in anyone's hands. But the key was that these were new aircraft developed by Charles, and they had defeated the Germans under Charles's command, while the Germans had recently inflicted heavy casualties on their army aircraft, forcing them to flee. Joffre, as the commander, had been completely helpless against this. Now, Charles had achieved this using this method, while Joffre casually remarked, "If I had such aircraft, I could do it too." He then erased all of Charles's achievements, telling people that army aircraft still had a purpose, and that Joffre could even do better than Charles. Carnes couldn't bear to listen any longer, his expression turning awkward. But Joffre remained unfazed, seemingly convinced he was right. "What we need to do is not hand over army aircraft to Charles, but purchase a batch of bombers, and then we can change the current situation." "But General," Carnes said, "how should we explain this to the public?" "That's a matter for the newspapers." Joffre glanced at the map. "As long as we hold a press conference to explain this clearly, and then achieve a few more victories." Carnes suddenly understood. Charles's bombers could create perfect victories for Joffre. Previously, boasting of victories to the media required tangible results, but with these bombers, all they needed to do was send them out and boast to reporters about how the army bombers had destroyed certain places and achieved such glorious victories. Reporters and the public couldn't verify this, because these results and victories all occurred within enemy-controlled territory. At that moment, a staff officer a few meters away reported to Joffre with a microphone, "General, Mr. Clemenceau, member of the Army Committee." Joffre's expression changed, and he stepped forward expressionlessly to take the phone. "Yes, Mr. Committee member, good, I understand. I have no objection, sir. Obey the decision of the Parliament." After hanging up the phone, Joffre's face turned extremely ugly. He understood what was going on. Public resentment was boiling over during the war, And the truce during Christmas was actually a silent protest by the soldiers against the government. This put immense pressure on the government and parliament, which had promised to end the war as soon as possible. They were unwilling to take on more risks for Joffre. "These bastards," Joffre muttered, "they only know their own interests and don't consider what is in France's best interest. They will regret their decision, General." Can sensed that things had changed and cautiously asked. Joffre gritted his teeth and ordered, "Hand over all the planes and pilots to the Paris City Defense Command." "Yes, General," Can responded readily. The image above shows former Prime Minister and current member of the Army Council, Jean-Claude Clemenceau. He is best known for proposing a series of reforms beneficial to workers to win public support, including an 8-hour workday, but these were never implemented. Not only were they not implemented, but the army was also deployed to suppress a major strike demanding an 8-hour workday. Chapter 248 Air Legion. The incorporation of army aircraft and pilots didn't go as Joffre had imagined. He didn't expect Gallieri to accept them immediately with a nod. The reality was quite the opposite. Gallieri repeatedly declined. "I'm very sorry, Commander-in-Chief, we already have the capacity to command a single Air Force unit. Incorporating so many aircraft and pilots is simply beyond our capabilities. Moreover, these aircraft are different from those used by the 1st Air Group. Incorporating them hastily could cause chaos. Your pilots were trained under a different system, and their training direction and operational concepts will conflict. Yes, I worry that they are accustomed to your operational style and will not be able to integrate into the Charlemagne operational system." The implication was that Joffre's defeatist approach was unworthy of joining the Charlemagne's victorious army. Joffre could easily hear the sarcasm in Gallieri's words, but because it was the council's decision, he could only suppress his anger and pretend not to understand. "No, you don't need to worry about that. I believe in Charles's abilities. They are actually looking forward to Charles's command. I think this is the right decision. I've had this idea for a long time. Charles's achievements are evident to all. They are very willing to obey Charles's orders." But no matter how much Joffre pleaded, Gallieri remained unmoved, refusing to accept the order, which infuriated Joffre. In a moment of impulse, Joffre thought of simply incorporating the army's air force into the infantry or disbanding it altogether. That way, Charles wouldn't gain anything, and Gallieri would still be hypocritically refusing. But reason prevented Joffre from doing so. The council's instructions to Joffre were clear: transfer the air force intact to the City Defense Command. Intact, not a single pilot can be missing. The council's goal was to satisfy the public and quell their anger. If Joffre were to make any underhanded moves in front of everyone, it would only add fuel to the fire and make the public even angrier. At that point, Parliament might even have to sacrifice Joffre. Having spent years navigating the complexities of military and political life, Joffre understood this. He knew he had to swallow his pride no matter what. After much deliberation, Joffre could only ask Clemenceau to mediate. Only then did Gallieni relent, reluctantly accepting the army planes and pilots. For some reason, news of Gallieni's refusal to accept the pilots leaked to the media. The next day, major newspapers rushed to publish the story on their front pages. Joffre has finally admitted his mistake. He agreed to incorporate the army aircraft into the Paris garrison command, but the garrison refused, believing that the pilots under Joffre's command were not pilots at all. Although the final result satisfied the public, even citizens without any command experience know what should have been done. Joffre, as commander-in-chief of France, made this obvious decision only after suffering such heavy casualties. Does this mean he lacks competence? Were his other decisions similar? French taxes and soldiers' lives should not be used as bargaining chips by certain individuals. This is a crime. Joffre was speechless. He knew that Gallieri had leaked the news, but he was powerless against him. All Joffre could do was roar within the command headquarters, ordering everyone not to bring in a single newspaper. For a whole month afterward, Joffre, who had a habit of reading newspapers, dared not touch a single one. Charles then reorganized the pilots. He conducted a survey and found a total of 617 experienced pilots capable of combat missions, including those from the Paris Flying Club. Charles divided these pilots into 6 air regiments, each further divided into 5 air squadrons, 3 fighter squadrons and 2 reconnaissance squadrons, each squadron consisting of approximately 20 men. One regiment was permanently stationed at the Flying Club to ensure air superiority over Paris, one bomber regiment was stationed at the Eric Aircraft Factory, and the remaining 4 regiments were deployed to the front lines at 4 airfields to support frontline operations. For pilots with flying skills and experience but unable to perform combat missions due to injuries, age, or physical limitations, Charles assigned them as instructors, providing rigorous technical and tactical training to the remaining 1,000-plus trainees using a strict elimination system. The airfields were deployed using a modern system. They were located in easily accessible locations and equipped with engineering corps for road and rail repair, with the engineers receiving targeted training in road and rail repair. This was to ensure the supply of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to the airfields. The early warning forces extended 30 kilometers outward in several directions towards the enemy, with 1 radio station in each direction and at least 2 telephones maintaining communication with the airfields in each unit. Each airfield was required to send a staff officer to the forward-covering infantry units, at least 1 per corps, equipped with a telephone and, if necessary, a radio. This was to ensure coordination between infantry and air force. Furthermore, Charles stipulated several methods of air-to-ground and ground-to-air communication. Aircraft could communicate basic information to ground troops via message bottles or by flying in different formations, such as figure 8s or figure of zeros. Ground troops, in turn, used signal flags and signal boards to signal aircraft in the air. Charles largely adopted modern Air Force practices, with some methods modified and adjusted for local conditions. For example, signal boards were typically white, reflective panels that ground infantry would arrange into shapes or arrows to indicate the direction and distance of attacked aircraft. However, these signal boards were clearly impractical in the European winter, with a vast expanse of white snow below. Using white signal boards in this situation would test the pilot's ability to find the correct path. Charles replaced them all with black or bright red, allowing the infantry to choose the color according to the situation. Within a week, the newly formed French Air Corps had stabilized and was operational. Bomber squadrons launched frequent sorties, repeatedly turning German artillery positions into infernos according to the infantry's requests, greatly boosting the morale of the frontline troops. Gallieri, watching Charles's arrangements, was amazed. He instructed Lieutenant Colonel Fernand to meticulously record every step Charles took. "This is what Air Force should do," Gallieri exclaimed. "Our Air Force should do this from now on. It's practically an aviation operations manual." He then added with a complaint. "That Charles guy, he actually said he had no experience commanding air combat, yet he can easily command an entire corps, methodically and effortlessly." Chapter 249 Legion of Honor Medal. Charles had been incredibly busy lately, having not taken a single holiday since Christmas. The reason was the unclear air combat situation at the front, and the sudden and brief nature of air battles meant that if Charles were on leave, by the time he was notified of an attack and arrived at headquarters, the air battle might already be over. Charles occasionally mentioned this to Gallieri. "General, I'd like to know, are all those lost holidays recorded?" Gallieri only vaguely replied, "The New Year is over, Colonel." The New Year was 5 days after Christmas, and Charles had been working tirelessly in command post that day. Gallieri's implication was that once the New Year was over, Charles was an adult, and for an adult, especially a colonel, not having holidays during wartime was the norm. As dusk fell and the city lights came on, Charles spent another day reorganizing the Air Force. In this era, even airplanes were a novelty, so Charles had to personally teach everyone about the organization, deployment, and air-ground coordination of the Air Force. He stretched and rubbed his aching neck, complaining inwardly. His allowance hadn't increased by a single penny, but his workload was much heavier than before. Being an adult didn't seem to be a good thing. "Colonel," Gallieri nodded at Charles while munching on bread. Charles understood and reluctantly stepped forward, thinking the old man had something else he wanted him to add. Gallieri hadn't done anything lately except nitpick at Charles's reorganization plans, sometimes demanding explanations of why he made those arrangements, and how to deal with any countermeasures the enemy might have. But this time Charles was wrong. When Charles reached his desk, Gallieri took 2 boxes from a drawer, along with a document, and handed them to him, saying calmly, "This is what you deserve, as a reward for your contribution to France." Charles took one of the boxes, opened it, and inside was a medal, neatly arranged in a square. Charles looked at Gallieni with a puzzled expression, but Gallieni simply shrugged and continued munching on the documents on the table. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand happened to pass by Charles, glanced at the medal, and froze. My God, the Legion of Honor. You've received the Legion of Honor, then. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand grabbed the medal and cheered to the others. Look, the colonel has received the Legion of Honor, a knighthood. The people in the command post cheered, one after another, stepping forward to shake Charles's hand and congratulate him, their eyes filled with envy as they looked at the medal. Suddenly, someone asked, "Where is Cobdo? Shouldn't he be taking some pictures right now? He's already reported back to the press. Call him back immediately. He'll be overjoyed. This has to be on the front page." Charles opened another box. Inside was another medal, which Charles also didn't recognize. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand excitedly introduced, "This is the Cross of Merit for military service. If you receive the Legion of Honor for military merit, you will automatically receive this medal, representing the highest military honor in France." Charles said, "Oh," realizing there was so much to it. Charles's reaction was indifferent. As a capitalist, he didn't value these things. He thought these medals were like knighthoods in the past, where the emperor could make a knight loyal for life and even risk his life with just a few verbal promises or a title. Wasn't that foolish? Medals were probably similar. Compared to these things, Charles would prefer something more tangible, like a prize of several thousand francs. Gallery noticed Charles's expression and nodded inwardly. As someone with experience, Gallery understood that this was just a capitalist's way of winning people over. Giving Charles these medals and honors was merely a response to citizen protests, satisfying citizens' expectations and thus appeasing them. Many people today may not know this, but Gallery remembers it vividly. 27 years ago, Wilson, the son-in-law of the Third Republic's president and also a member of parliament, colluded with the Army's deputy chief of staff to sell large quantities of Legion of Honor medals. This medal, considered the highest honor by the French military and civilians, something they were willing to risk their lives for, was selling for only a few thousand francs at the time. After the scandal was exposed, Wilson was only convicted of a minor offense and soon acquitted. He was then re-elected to Parliament, and a large number of other members of Parliament and ministers involved escaped punishment. With such a scandal, what honor could the Legion of Honor possibly hold? "Hey, Charles," someone shouted, "don't you think we should celebrate?" Charles was enlightened and responded tactfully, "You're right, it certainly deserves a celebration. How about the Officers' Club? All expenses tonight are on me." A cheer erupted in the command post. The staff officers were more excited than if they had won a battle. "Are you coming too, General?" Charles turned to Gallery and asked. "No, thank you." Gallery shook his head. "Just bring me a cup of coffee," Charles readily agreed. Gallery didn't actually need coffee. The orderly could bring him any time. He just didn't want Charles to feel indebted to him. Today was Monday, and there were only a handful of people in the club. Most officers didn't choose to visit the club on this day. Many documents and matters that had been delayed due to negotiations with the government needed to be resolved on this day. But Charles and his group instantly filled the club upon their arrival. As soon as they entered, they eagerly shouted to the bartender, "A cocktail, Lucia, perhaps we should get a glass of champagne." "Good idea, this is a day to celebrate." The bartender, Lucia, skillfully poured drinks into the cocktail shaker, asking curiously, "What's the good news today? Did Charles win another battle?" No. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand nodded towards Charles, who had followed behind. "The most celebratory thing today is," he paused intentionally, then unexpectedly added, "it's that Charles has covered all the expenses. Let's celebrate, gentlemen." The staff cheered, and someone vigorously shook a champagne bottle, suddenly opening it and spraying it at everyone. The previously dull and quiet club instantly became lively, as if it had been ignited. Lucia glanced at Charles surrounded by the crowd, then nodded to another bartender, "Gerald, can you take my place?" Gerald took the cocktail shaker from Lucia, giving him a meaningful look with a faint smile. "Isn't he too young for you, Lucia?" "I heard he's already an adult," Lucia replied generously. "No one would refuse a hero, especially a very wealthy one." The image above shows the Legion of Honor medal. The image above shows the Battle Cross medal. Chapter 250. The Lady in White. Lucia poured herself a cocktail, holding it with two long, slender fingers. She gracefully walked around the bar to Charles, leaned against the table, and with a natural yet alluring air, raised her glass to Charles with a smile. "Colonel, when you said you'd cover all the expenses, did you include this one?" "Of course," Charles replied. A murmur of excitement rippled through the surrounding officers. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand patted Charles's shoulder, leaned closer, and whispered in his ear, You're in luck, Colonel. Many people want to buy Lucia a drink, but no one has managed it. Charles simply smiled slightly, saying nothing. The officers tactfully made way for Charles and Lucia sat down gracefully opposite Charles. Then she suddenly noticed the wariness in Charles's eyes, and his hand even rested on the revolver at his waist. "You don't seem to welcome me," Lucia asked, puzzled. Charles's voice was cold. "Speak, what do you want from me?" Lucia paused, then laughed. "I don't know what you're talking about. I overheard what you were saying to Gerald just now." Charles's eyes were fixed on Lucia. "You can't refuse a rich hero. Is there a problem?" Lucia's eyes still held amusement. She even provocatively looked Charles up and down, like a leopard eyeing its prey. "If I hadn't run into Dominic, I might have believed you," Charles replied, his fingers lightly unfastening the holster. Lucia's expression changed slightly. She knew where the problem lay. Charles said slowly, "Before this, I could understand it as you being an independent woman. Of course, there are some people in this world who are unwilling to give up love for money, and you might be one of them. However, you openly tell others that you approached me for money." Lucia laughed, her beautiful blue eyes looking directly at Charles without fear, her tone carrying a hint of coquetry. "Perhaps, money and love can both be had. You're more like a spy," Charles interrupted Lucia. "Working as a bartender in the officers' club could yield a lot of information you need. Dominic might be a good choice, but you can't choose him because you have to obey orders from your superiors. Am I right?" Ever since meeting Harley at the ball, Charles had become more wary of women. He had always thought spies were far removed from him, characters that only appeared in movie plots. Since then, he had discovered that spies were actually all around him. Lucia in front of him might be one of them. Charles drew his revolver, held it in his hand, and pointed it at Lucia under the cover of the table. He said, "If I arrest you now and send men to thoroughly search your residence, we might find something as evidence." Charles added, "Even if we don't find anything, there's nothing to lose, don't you think?" Lucia's expression changed again, a flicker of panic in her eyes. She glanced around and gently shook her head. "You can't do that, Colonel," Charles grunted. "You have 1 minute." Charles hadn't acted because spies at this time were too complex. Lucia wasn't necessarily a German spy, she could be British, Russian, or a capitalist's informant planted in the military. Except for the former, all the others could be considered one of us. Lucia hesitated, then explained, "I don't know how to convince you. I don't belong to any organization you know. In fact, we organized ourselves." Charles continued to grip his pistol in his right hand, took a small sip from the wine glass on the table with his left, and coldly ordered, expressionless, "Continue. You'd better tell the truth." "I was originally Belgian." Lucia's gaze towards Charles flashed with admiration and sincerity. "Your actions in Belgium have inspired many people. So, we spontaneously organized a team. We hope to do something for this war, and we hope to make a difference under your command." Charles raised an eyebrow. It sounded plausible. The Belgians did indeed have such a need. After all, helping the Allies was helping themselves, and Charles had a strong appeal to Belgium. He was practically the embodiment of victory. But Charles certainly wouldn't easily believe this woman. Spies are good actors, especially female spies. They are adept at using their beauty and even their bodies to make men believe them. Harley was a living example. "You mean," Charles looked at Lucia with a hint of sarcasm, "you've been here all this time just to make contact with me?" "You could say that," Lucia nodded slightly, "but you've come here far too infrequently. Last time I thought it was a rare opportunity, but Dominic ruined it." Charles recalled that Lucia had indeed tried to speak with him through Lieutenant Colonel Fernand, but then Dominic appeared. Charles shook his head with a smile. "A lie. You have no evidence to prove what you're saying is true." How can I prove it?" Lucia was both anxious and angry. "Perhaps you should first prove that we are guilty, that we haven't done anything to harm the war. On the contrary, we've provided the British with a lot of intelligence." "The British?" Charles looked at Lucia with suspicion. "Yes," Lucia replied, "the British intelligence network is far superior to that of the French. We know some British spies, and therefore secretly provide them with military intelligence through civilian connections." Then, as if struck by a sudden thought, Lucia added, "You can verify this with the British. We have provided the locations and numbers of artillery positions near Condos and Anlor, as well as the troop deployment in Anatolia." Suddenly, an organization called the White Lady popped into Charles's mind. Just as Lucia had described, this was a self-organized Belgian civilian agency that wanted to provide intelligence to the Allies. Therefore, They contacted a British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and became part of its spy network. During the war, they repeatedly performed meritorious service, providing the Allies with much valuable intelligence. Moreover, this organization needed no funding or support. They had only one request: to be recognized as soldiers, not spies. They wanted to be seen as fighters against the invaders. Charles asked with some skepticism, "You want to fight under my command? Then, what are the conditions?" Lucia gently shook her head. "There are no conditions. We only want to be seen as soldiers, and organize like the rest of the army." Charles was a little dizzy. It seemed that his reputation in Belgium had finally paid off. The lady in white wasn't going after the British as in history, but had come to him instead, and their formation seemed to have been brought forward. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.